The sun hung low over the county of dust, a weary orange disk that seemed as tired as Lin felt. He leaned on his rusted hoe, the wooden handle smooth from years of use, and wiped sweat from his brow with a tattered sleeve. Before him stretched his field, a patch of cracked earth the color of dried blood, where nothing but stubborn weeds and the occasional withered stalk dared grow. For 3 generations, his family had worked this land, and for 3 generations, it had yielded only disappointment and hunger. Lin's stomach growled, a familiar hollow ache that had become his constant companion. He was 23 years old, with calloused hands and a lean frame that spoke of too little food and too much labor. In this world of cultivators with glowing auras and nobles with bloodlines tracing back to mythical beasts, Lin had nothing. No talent for channeling spiritual energy, no ancestral legacy, not even the basic affinity for earth that might have made farming less futile. He was simply Lin, a peasant of the county of dust, destined to toil until his body broke. He sighed, the sound lost in the vast emptiness of the landscape. The county of dust earned its name, fine particles of reddish soil lifted with every breeze, coating everything in a thin film of despair. To the north, the distant silhouette of the royal palace stood against the horizon, its white spires just visible through the haze. It might as well have been on another world for all it mattered to Lin. As twilight deepened, Lin gathered his tools. His back ached from hours of digging at unyielding ground, his fingers stiff around the hose handle. He took one last look at the field, at the barren rows where he'd planted the last of his seed stock 2 weeks ago. Not a single sprout had emerged. Another season lost. He turned to leave, his boots scuffing through the dirt. Then his foot caught on something hard and smooth, half buried near the edge of the field. Lin stumbled, barely catching himself before he fell face first into the dust. He cursed under his breath, rubbing his shin where it had struck the object. Kneeling, he brushed away the soil. What emerged was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was a flat rectangle, about the size of his palm, made of some material that felt cool and smooth like polished stone but lighter than it should be. Its surface was dark, but as Lin's fingers traced its edges, faint lines of blue light began to pulse beneath the surface. Lin's breath caught. He'd heard stories of cultivators finding ancient artifacts in forgotten ruins, objects that granted power or wisdom. But those were tales for children, and he was no cultivator. Still, curiosity overcame caution. He dug around the object, freeing it from the earth. As he lifted it, the blue light intensified, spreading across the surface in intricate patterns. Suddenly, the entire slate lit up. Lin nearly dropped it in surprise. Colors bloomed across its face, vibrant greens, bright yellows, cheerful blues. Pixelated shapes formed a landscape, rolling hills, a small cottage, a plot of empty soil. At the top, cheerful blocky letters appeared, "Welcome, God. Grow your divine garden." Lin stared, his mind struggling to comprehend. The device hummed softly in his hand, warm but not hot. A tutorial message popped up, "Tap to plant your first seeds. Sun-blessed seeds available." Below, a cartoonish icon of a seed packet glowed invitingly. For a long moment, Lin just stood there, the glowing slate casting an eerie light on the darkening field around him. Part of him whispered that this was dangerous, that strange artifacts brought trouble. But another part, the part that was tired, hungry, and desperate for any escape from his grim reality, reached out with a trembling finger. He tapped the seed icon. The screen changed. A pixelated hand appeared, holding a tiny seed. With another tap, Lin placed it in one of the empty garden plots on the screen. The seed vanished into the soil, replaced by a small mound. A progress bar appeared above it, growing, 0%. Nothing happened. No explosion of light, no surge of energy. The slate just continued to display its cheerful garden, the progress bar slowly ticking upward. Lin felt a strange mix of disappointment and relief. Maybe it was just a toy, some cultivators discarded amusement. Still, the colors were pretty, the simple act of planting something and watching it grow, even virtually, felt oddly satisfying. He tapped a few more times, planting seeds in the other empty plots. The game responded with cheerful sound effects, little chimes and rustles. A quest notification appeared, "First harvest, grow 5 sun-blessed plants." Lin smiled faintly. It was mindless, simple, but for the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about his empty stomach or the hopeless field. The sky had turned fully dark by the time Lin tucked the slate into his tunic and made his way back to his hut. The device continued to glow softly through the fabric, a steady blue pulse like a heartbeat. He ate his meager dinner of boiled roots, glancing occasionally at the strange object on his crude table. Before sleeping, he checked it one more time. The progress bars had reached 15%. The plants were tiny pixelated sprouts now. He fell asleep to dreams of golden fields. *****. Morning came with a strange light. Lin woke to sunlight streaming through the cracks in his hut's walls, but there was something different about it, a warmer, richer quality. He sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and stumbled outside to begin another day of futile labor. He stopped dead in his tracks. His field, which yesterday had been barren red dirt, was now covered in a carpet of grain. Not ordinary grain, this was golden, each stalk glowing with a soft inner light. The plant stood waist-high, heavy with plump kernels that shimmered like captured sunlight. A sweet, clean scent filled the air, unlike anything Lin had ever smelled. It was the aroma of growth, of abundance, of life where there had been only death. Lin's knees buckled. He sank to the ground, his hands reaching out to touch the nearest stalk. It felt real, solid, warm, alive. He plucked a single kernel. It came away easily, resting in his palm like a tiny sun. He brought it to his mouth, hesitated, then bit down. Flavor exploded on his tongue. Sweet and nutty, with an aftertaste that seemed to spread warmth through his entire body. The hollow ache in his stomach vanished instantly, replaced by a feeling of fullness and energy he hadn't known in years. Lin stared at the field, then at his hands, then back at the field. This wasn't possible. He scrambled back into his hut and grabbed the slate from where he'd left it on the table. The screen showed his virtual garden, now with 5 fully grown pixelated plants. A notification flashed, quest complete. First harvest achieved. Reward, 50 divine points. The plants on screen looked exactly like the ones outside, golden, glowing, perfect. Lin's mind raced, making connections he didn't want to make. He'd planted virtual seeds. Now real plants grew. The game called itself a divine garden. He remembered the welcome message, "Welcome, God." No. That was absurd. He was Lin, the talentless peasant. Gods didn't live in crumbling huts in the county of dust. Gods didn't have empty bellies and calloused hands. This had to be coincidence, or some strange cultivator magic he didn't understand. But the grain was real. The hunger that had haunted him for years was gone after eating a single kernel. He spent the morning in a daze, walking through his field, touching the plants, harvesting a few stalks to examine more closely. The grain practically thrummed with energy. When he held a handful close, he could feel a gentle warmth radiating from it, like holding sunlight. As noon approached, Lin heard voices approaching. He looked up to see a group of villagers from the nearby settlement, ragged men and women who shared his poverty. They were pointing not at his field, but beyond it, at the distant horizon. "Lin," called Old Man Huan, his voice cracking with excitement or fear. "Look! Look at the palace." Lin followed their pointing fingers. The royal palace stood miles away, its white walls and spires clear in the midday sun. But something was different. The vast lawns that surrounded it, manicured expanses of green that were the pride of the royal gardeners, were no longer green. They were gold. Even from this distance, Lin could see the distinctive glow. Patches of the same golden grain that covered his field now sprouted across the palace lawns, spreading in irregular patterns like spilled paint. The plants shimmered in the sunlight, visible even through the haze of distance. The villagers clustered around him, their faces a mix of awe and terror. "What is it?" whispered Mei, a young woman who worked the neighboring plot. "Is it a blessing? A curse?" Lin didn't answer. He stared at the distant palace, then down at the glowing slate in his hand. The screen showed his completed garden, cheerful and innocent. He thought of his simple taps last night, planting virtual seeds in virtual soil. And now identical plants grew on the royal palace lawn. A cold realization began to dawn, cutting through his confusion. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't cultivator magic he didn't understand. The slate in his hand, the game, was doing something. Changing something. But how? And why? And what had he just set in motion? The morning sun cast long shadows across Lin's field, illuminating the golden grain that swayed in a gentle breeze. For 3 days now, he had been harvesting the miraculous crop, his calloused hands moving with a rhythm born of desperation turned to wonder. Each stalk yielded plump kernels that shimmered with an inner light, filling his woven baskets faster than he could carry them to his ramshackle hut. Lin paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the sleeve of his patched tunic. His stomach, once a constant ache of emptiness, now felt comfortably full from the previous night's meal of boiled grain. The impossible harvest had transformed his existence from survival to something approaching abundance, though confusion still clouded his thoughts. Every time he looked toward the distant silhouette of the royal palace, he remembered Old Man Juan's trembling finger pointing at the identical glowing crop sprouting on the palace lawns. "It's the same," the elderly villager had whispered yesterday, his eyes wide with awe. "The emperor's gardeners are weeping, they say. The royal lawns look like your field." Lin had only nodded, his fingers instinctively touching the rectangular slate tucked into his belt. The glowing device, he still didn't know what to call it, felt warm against his skin, a constant reminder of the connection between its pixelated world and the impossible reality around him. He sat on an overturned basket, the golden grain spilling around his feet like spilled treasure. Fishing the slate from his belt, he tapped its smooth surface. The familiar pixel art garden appeared, showing neat rows of virtual crops where he'd planted the sun-blessed seeds days earlier. A notification blinked in the corner, "Harvest complete. Plus 50 divine points." Lin smiled faintly. The game's cheerful chimes and bright colors felt absurdly out of place in his dusty world, yet he couldn't deny the connection. As his thumb scrolled through the interface, a new icon caught his eye, a swirling vortex of colored gems labeled, "Clear Corruption." The tutorial text explained it in simple terms: match 3 gems of the same color to cleanse the land. Earn bonus points for combos. Another minigame, Lin murmured to himself. He'd seen similar puzzles in tavern tales about distant cities where nobles played games of chance and strategy. This one looked simple enough. With nothing better to do during his break, he tapped the icon. The screen transformed into a grid of colorful gems, ruby reds, sapphire blues, emerald greens, and golden yellows arranged in random patterns. Lin's brow furrowed as he studied the layout. The objective showed at the top, "Clear 50 corrupted tiles." He tapped a blue gem, sliding it downward to align with 2 others of the same color. The 3 gems vanished with a satisfying chime, replaced by new ones falling from the top of the grid. Not so hard, he thought, his fingers moving with increasing confidence. He found a cluster of red gems, matched them, then spotted a potential chain reaction, if he moved this green one here. As Lin solved the puzzle, something strange began to happen. The slate in his hands grew warmer, then hot enough that he almost dropped it. A low hum vibrated through the device, rising in pitch until it became a barely audible whine. Golden light seeped from the edges of the slate, not the gentle glow of before, but a brilliant, piercing radiance that made Lin squint. He completed another match, 5 yellow gems in a row, and the game announced, "Combo," with flashing letters. At that exact moment, the golden light erupted. It wasn't a burst so much as a wave, flowing outward from the slate in all directions. Lin watched, frozen in place, as the light swept across his field, making the golden grain shimmer as if kissed by dawn. It continued beyond his plot, flowing over the stone wall that marked the boundary of his land, then across the dusty road that led to the neighboring village. The wave moved with impossible speed, visible as a shimmering curtain of gold that raced toward the horizon. Lin stood up, the slate still clutched in his trembling hands. He could see the light passing over Old Man Juan's hut 100 paces away, then May's smaller dwelling beyond that. It flowed up the hills where the wealthier villagers lived, then toward the distant manor house where Lord Kale's family resided. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then the changes began. First, the air itself seemed to clear. For weeks, a faint miasma had hung over the county, a sickly sweetness that old-timers said presaged ill fortune. Lin hadn't paid it much mind, focused on his own starvation. Now that scent vanished, replaced by the clean, crisp smell of rain-washed earth. From the direction of the neighboring village, a sound rose, not screams of terror, but cries of wonder. Lin could make out individual voices carrying on the wind. "The boils. They're gone. Grandfather's fever broke. By the ancestors, the sickness has lifted." Lin's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew about the plague, of course. Everyone did. It had started in the western villages 3 months ago, a strange affliction that caused black boils to erupt on the skin, followed by fever and death within days. The county magistrate had posted notices warning people to avoid affected areas, but the sickness had been spreading steadily closer. Just yesterday, Old Man Juan had mentioned his cousin's family taking ill in Oak Creek Village. Now, according to the distant shouts, the plague had vanished. Lin looked down at the slate. The match 3 puzzle showed mission complete, with fireworks exploding across the screen. A new notification appeared, corruption cleared. Regional purity restored to 100%. Bonus, plus 100 divine points. What did I do? Lin whispered, his voice barely audible. He was still staring at the screen when running footsteps approached. May skidded to a halt before him, her plain dress dusty from the road, her face flushed with excitement and fear. Lin. Have you heard? He shook his head mutely. It's a miracle, she gasped, bending over to catch her breath. The plague, gone. Every sick person in Oak Creek woke up healed this morning. The black boils vanished like they were never there. Before Lin could respond, more villagers arrived, Old Man Juan hobbling as fast as his aged legs would carry him, followed by 2 farmers Lin recognized from market days. Not just the plague, Old Man Juan said, his voice trembling. Something else, something impossible. The old man's eyes were wide with something beyond wonder, with primal fear. He pointed a shaking finger toward the hills where Lord Kale's manor stood. The Kale family, he whispered. Gone. Gone. Lin repeated stupidly. Vanished, one of the farmers said, his face pale. I was delivering firewood to the manor this morning. The gates stood open. No guards. I went inside. He swallowed hard. The tables were set for breakfast. Food still warm in the pots. Clothing laid out for the day. But not a soul in the entire manor. Not Lord Kale, not his wife, not their 3 children, not the 50 servants. As if they'd never existed. May crossed herself, a peasant superstition against evil spirits. How is that possible? The same way the plague vanished, Old Man Juan said slowly, his eyes fixed on Lin. The same way golden grain grows on palace lawns. All eyes turned to Lin. He felt their gazes like physical weight, saw the dawning suspicion in their expressions. They knew he'd found something strange. They'd seen him with the glowing slate. They'd witnessed his barren field transform overnight. I don't. Lin began, then trailed off. What could he say? That he'd played a game on a magic rectangle and solved a puzzle with colored gems? That sounded like the ravings of a madman. He looked down at the slate again, hoping for some explanation in its glowing interface. Instead, he found a new achievement notification blinking insistently, Plague Eradicator unlocked. Reward, Divine Favor +1. Description, you have purified a region of mortal corruption. Beware unintended consequences. Beware unintended consequences, Lin read aloud, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. While the villagers debated the miracles in hushed, awed tones, Lin's thoughts churned. The game had called the puzzle, Clear Corruption. He'd assumed it meant virtual corruption, some game mechanic affecting the pixelated land. But what if corruption meant something else? What if the plague was corruption? And what if Lord Kale's family? A cold dread settled in Lin's stomach. The tutorial had mentioned the noble family secretly cultivated the plague for profit. Was that the corruption the game had cleared? Not just the sickness, but its source. Lin. May's voice broke through his thoughts. Are you well? You look pale. I'm fine, he said automatically, tucking the slate back into his belt. Just, surprised. Like everyone. Old Man Juan studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Miracles are frightening things, the old man said. They break the world's rules. When rules break, people get hurt, even if they deserve it. The villagers gradually dispersed, returning to their own plots with whispered conversations and backward glances at Lin. He pretended to resume his harvesting, but his hands moved mechanically, his mind elsewhere. As afternoon shadows lengthened, a new sound reached Lin's ears, not village chatter, but something else entirely. A low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. He looked up, scanning the horizon. To the north, where the mountains marked the border of the County of Dust, specks appeared in the sky. They grew larger as they approached, resolving into human figures riding what appeared to be glowing swords. The figures moved with impossible grace, cutting through the air faster than any bird. Cultivators. Lin had heard tales of them, men and women who cultivated spiritual energy, who could fly on swords, who lived for centuries. They rarely visited backwater counties like Dust, except when collecting rare herbs or investigating disturbances in the spiritual flow. The cultivators, 3 of them, dressed in robes of pale blue with silver trim, circled high above the county, their heads turning as if scanning the land below. One pointed toward Lin's field, where the golden grain still glowed faintly in the fading light. Another gestured toward the empty Kale Manor. They didn't descend, not yet. Instead, they hovered for several minutes, then turned and flew back toward the mountains, moving with purposeful speed. Lin watched them until they vanished from sight, his hand resting on the slate at his belt. The device felt warm again, almost comforting. On its screen, unnoticed until now, a new quest had appeared: Perfect Orchard, plant 10 fruit trees in a harmonious arrangement. Reward, Divine Grove Achievement. He stared at the simple pixel art trees, then at the real world around him, the miraculous grain, the vanished plague, the erased noble family, the investigating cultivators. A hysterical laugh bubbled in his throat, but he choked it down. Just a game, he whispered to himself. It's just a relaxing game. But as he looked at the empty hills where a noble family had vanished, and the northern sky where cultivators had come investigating, and the slate that promised more achievements for planting virtual trees, Lin felt the first cold trickle of understanding. He wasn't playing a game. The game was playing with the world. And he had no idea how to stop. The morning after the plague's disappearance, Lin sat on the rough wooden stool in his hut, the smartphone glowing softly in his hands. The golden grain harvest had filled his stomach for the first time in years, and the empty manor of Lord Kale stood as a silent testament to something he couldn't quite comprehend. Yet the device's screen beckoned with its simple pixel art world, a comforting distraction from the growing unease in his chest. He scrolled through the game's menus, his calloused fingers tracing the smooth surface. The divine interface displayed his achievements: First Harvest complete, Plague Eradicator unlocked. Below them, a new section had appeared: Animal Husbandry. Lin tapped it, and a cheerful chime echoed in the quiet hut. A pixelated chicken appeared on screen, rendered in bright reds and yellows with comically large eyes. Text scrolled across the bottom: Lucky chicken available for adoption. Feed virtual corn to increase luck stats. Lin hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. The last time he'd interacted with this game, an entire noble family had vanished. But the chicken looked harmless, even cute in its blocky digital form. And the description promised luck, something a peasant like him could always use more of. What's one more tap, he murmured to himself, the words hanging in the dusty air of his hut. He pressed the Adopt button. The chicken pixel waddled into a digital coop that appeared on his farm layout. Lin spent the next hour feeding it virtual corn through simple taps, watching as little heart icons floated above its head. The game registered each interaction with satisfying sound effects: a soft plink for the corn, a cheerful cluck when the chicken ate. Lin found himself smiling despite everything, the rhythmic tapping providing a strange comfort. This felt normal. This felt like the simple mobile games he'd heard traveling merchants describe, not like something that could rewrite reality. As evening fell, Lin placed the smartphone on his makeshift table, a flat stone balanced on 2 stumps. The chicken continued to roam in its digital coop, occasionally pecking at invisible grains. Lin lay on his straw mat, staring at the thatched roof above. Through the gaps in the roofing, he could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The air carried the scent of the golden grain from his field, a sweet, almost honey-like aroma that still felt foreign after years of barren earth. He thought about the cultivators he'd seen yesterday, 3 figures soaring on glowing swords, their robes fluttering like banners against the sky. They'd flown over his field, their eyes scanning the golden crops before moving toward the empty manor. Lin had hidden behind his hut, heart pounding, certain they would descend and demand answers he didn't have. But they'd merely observed before flying away, leaving trails of faint light that dissolved into the twilight. Maybe it's over, Lin whispered to the darkness. Maybe the game's done changing things. The thought brought little comfort. He'd seen the villagers' faces when they reported the plague's disappearance, all mixed with fear. Old Man Juan had gripped his shoulder with trembling hands, tears streaming down his wrinkled face as he described how the black boils on his granddaughter's skin had simply vanished. May from the neighboring plot had watched Lin with new intensity, her eyes lingering on the slate he carried everywhere now. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of glowing fields and empty manors. He woke to heat. Not the gentle warmth of morning sun, but a searing, oppressive heat that pressed against his skin like a physical weight. Lin's eyes snapped open to find his hut glowing with an orange-red light that pulsed rhythmically, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The air shimmered with waves of distortion, and the scent of ozone and burning wood filled his nostrils. "What?" he began, but the words died in his throat. From the corner where he'd left the smartphone, a sound emerged, not the digital clucking of yesterday, but a deep, resonant cry that vibrated through the very planks of his hut. It started low, building into a piercing shriek that made Lin clamp his hands over his ears. The table where the smartphone lay began to smoke, the wood blackening and curling at the edges. Lin scrambled to his feet, straw from his mat clinging to his threadbare clothes. He lunged for the device, his fingers closing around its warm surface. The screen blazed with impossible brightness, showing not the pixelated chicken but a swirling vortex of fire and feathers. Text scrolled frantically across the display, "Lucky chicken evolution triggered. Phoenix manifestation in progress." "No, no, no," Lin breathed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The hut exploded outward. Not with force, but with light and heat that dissolved the thatched roof and wooden walls into ash and embers that rose into the sky like inverted snowfall. Lin found himself standing in the open, his field of golden grain around him, holding the smartphone that now felt like a burning coal in his hands. Above him, something unfolded. Wings first, vast, feathered wings that stretched from horizon to horizon, each primary feather longer than Lin's entire body and tipped with living flame. They blotted out the morning sun, casting the county of dust into premature twilight shot through with crimson and gold. The body that followed was a mountain of iridescent plumage, shifting colors with every movement, deep ruby reds, molten oranges, brilliant golds that hurt to look at directly. A neck arched like a serpent's, crowned with a head that held eyes like captured suns, burning with ancient intelligence. The phoenix had arrived. Its cry shook the earth. Lin felt the vibration through the soles of his feet, a deep bass note that resonated in his bones. The golden grain around him bent away from the creature, stalks flattening as if bowing to royalty. In the distance, Lin could see villagers fleeing their homes, tiny figures scrambling toward the hills. Old Man Juan stood frozen in his doorway, his face upturned, mouth open in silent awe. Heat radiated from the phoenix in visible waves. The air above its wings rippled like water, and where its tail feathers brushed the ground, the soil turned to glass. Lin watched, paralyzed, as the creature beat its wings once, a motion that seemed to happen in slow motion despite its impossible speed. The resulting windstorm flattened what remained of his hut and sent Lin tumbling backward through his grain field. He landed hard, the smartphone slipping from his grasp to land in the dirt beside him. As he pushed himself up, spitting soil from his mouth, he saw the phoenix rise. It ascended with deliberate grace, each wing beat sending gales across the landscape. Trees in the distant forests bent, then snapped, then burst into flame. Lin watched in horror as entire swaths of woodland ignited, fire spreading with unnatural speed as if the very concept of combustion had been rewritten. The sky filled with smoke that coiled into strange, intricate patterns, as if the phoenix's passage was drawing sigils in the air. "My chicken," Lin whispered, the absurdity of the words almost making him laugh hysterically. "I just wanted a lucky chicken." He grabbed the smartphone, his fingers trembling. The screen still showed the vortex of fire and feathers, but now a new interface had appeared, a grid of tiles in various colors, labeled, "Containment Puzzle." Instructions scrolled beneath, "Match tiles to return Phoenix to coop. Difficulty, Extreme." Lin's mind raced. The match, 3 puzzle from yesterday had erased a plague and a noble family. What would solving this one do? But as he watched the phoenix complete another circuit above the county, its wings trailing fire that ignited another forest to the north, he knew he had no choice. His fingers moved with desperate precision. The puzzle was complex, dozens of tiles in shifting patterns of red, orange, gold, and white. He matched 3 gold tiles, and on screen, a section of the phoenix's pixelated form dimmed slightly. In the sky, the real creature faltered in its flight, one wing dipping as if suddenly heavy. "It's working," Lin breathed, his focus narrowing to the screen. He matched orange tiles, then red, then a chain of white that cleared an entire row. With each match, the phoenix above grew smaller. Not shrinking uniformly, but flickering between sizes. One moment its wings still blotted out the sun, the next they were merely the size of a large bird, then back to continent-spanning proportions. The effect was dizzying, reality itself seeming to stutter around the creature. Lin's hands grew slick with sweat. He wiped them on his pants, leaving dark streaks on the rough fabric. The puzzle demanded concentration he hadn't known he possessed. Patterns emerged in the tile arrangements, symmetries and sequences that hinted at deeper logic. He matched 4 white tiles in a square formation, and the smartphone chimed with particular satisfaction. Above, the phoenix emitted a sound that was equal parts frustration and resignation. Its form stabilized at the size of a large eagle, then shrank further, compressing into a sphere of pure light that hurtled toward Lin's position. He threw up an arm instinctively, but the light didn't strike him. It passed over his head and coalesced behind him, resolving into the familiar red and yellow chicken from yesterday. The creature pecked at the ground, completely ordinary except for a faint golden sheen to its feathers that faded even as Lin watched. Silence fell. Not true silence, the crackle of burning forest still carried on the wind, and distant screams echoed from the village, but the overwhelming presence of the phoenix had vanished. Lin sank to his knees, the smartphone slipping from his numb fingers to land in the dirt. The chicken wandered over and pecked at his knee, then let out a soft cluck. For several minutes, Lin simply breathed, each inhalation tasting of smoke and ozone. His field was ruined, the golden grain flattened into tangled mats, many stalks blackened at the tips from the heat. His hut was gone, reduced to a circle of ash and a few charred support beams. In the distance, columns of smoke rose from at least 3 different forest fires, their dark plumes staining the morning sky. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty air. The chicken clucked again, as if in answer. Lin was still kneeling there, trying to process the scale of the destruction, when movement caught his eye from the tree line at the edge of his field. A figure emerged, not a villager, but someone dressed in leathers dyed in earthy browns and greens, with intricate beadwork depicting various animals woven into the fabric. The man moved with a hunter's grace, his eyes fixed not on Lin, but on the chicken. Lin scrambled to his feet, grabbing the smartphone and shoving it into the pouch at his belt. The stranger approached, his steps measured, his expression one of reverent awe. As he drew closer, Lin could see tattoos coiling up his arms, serpents and birds rendered in blue ink that seemed to shift in the light. The man stopped 10 paces away, his eyes still locked on the chicken. Then, to Lin's utter confusion, he dropped to one knee, bowing his head deeply. "Divine omen," the man murmured, his voice carrying the accent of distant mountains. "The phoenix has returned to us in humble form, testing our faith." He remained kneeling, head bowed, as the chicken pecked at a beetle near his boot. Lin stared, his mind struggling to catch up. This wasn't a villager. This was someone new, a scout, perhaps, from the beast-taming clans mentioned in travelers' tales. And he was worshipping Lin's accidentally created, nearly catastrophic chicken. Lin began, then stopped, unsure what to say. The scout raised his head, his eyes shifting from the chicken to Lin. They were sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, the ruined field, the ash where Lin's hut had stood, the smartphone pouch at Lin's belt. "You are its keeper," the scout said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "The one blessed by the phoenix's choice." Before Lin could respond, the scout bowed again, this time to him. "The clans will hear of this. A new era dawns." Then he rose, turned, and melted back into the tree line with the same silent grace with which he'd arrived. Lin stood alone in his ruined field, the chicken pecking contentedly at his feet, the weight of what had just happened settling over him like a physical shroud. In the distance, the forest fires continued to burn, their smoke painting the sky in shades of gray and black. Somewhere beyond the hills, cultivators were likely already sensing the disturbance. And now the beast-taming clans knew. He looked down at the chicken, then at the smartphone in his pouch. The game's next quest still glowed on the screen when he pulled it out: build perfect orchard. Required, 10 fruit trees, decorative fountain, seating area. Lin swallowed hard, the taste of smoke and impending disaster thick in his throat. The morning after the Phoenix incident brought a landscape of ash and ruin to the county of dust. Lin stood amidst the charred remains of his hut, the thatched roof collapsed inward, blackened timbers jutting at odd angles like broken teeth. His field, once glowing with golden grain, was now a patchwork of scorched earth and stubborn sprouts trying to push through the ash. The air still carried the faint scent of ozone and burnt wood, mingling with the dampness of morning dew. Lin sighed, running a hand through his hair as he surveyed the damage. The chicken, now just a regular, clucking chicken, pecked at the ground near his feet, completely oblivious to its previous fiery incarnation. In the distance, the forests that ringed the county smoldered, thin tendrils of smoke rising against the pale dawn sky. Villagers moved about cautiously, their faces etched with confusion and fear as they whispered about the divine omen and the sudden fires. But Lin's mind wasn't on the destruction. It was on his smartphone, which he held carefully in both hands. The screen glowed softly, displaying the pixel art garden interface. A new notification blinked persistently in the corner: Perfect Orchard Achievement Progress, 45%. Add decorative structures to boost aesthetic points. He tapped the notification, and the screen shifted to show his virtual orchard. It was a cheerful grid of pixelated fruit trees, apples, pears, and something labeled Moon Peach that he'd unlocked after solving a particularly tricky Match 3 puzzle. The trees looked healthy, their leaves a vibrant green, but the achievement meter insisted he needed more aesthetic points to reach perfection. Scrolling through the decorative items menu, Lin's eyes landed on the celestial fountain. It was labeled as a premium decoration that would provide a significant boost to hydration and aesthetic scores. The description read, a magnificent fountain said to be inspired by the heavens themselves. Its waters never run dry, bringing life and beauty to any garden. Lin hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the purchase button. The game required no currency, no coins, no gems, no real-world money. It simply asked for confirmation. He remembered the golden grain, the vanished plague, the phoenix. Each action had cost him nothing but a tap, yet the world around him had changed in ways he couldn't comprehend. But the desire to complete the achievement burned in him. He'd always been a peasant with nothing to his name, no talent, no bloodline, just endless toil in barren fields. This game, this glowing slate, gave him a sense of accomplishment he'd never known. The progress bars filling up, the achievements unlocking, the virtual rewards, they made him feel capable in a world that had always told him he was worthless. Just one more decoration, he murmured to himself, pushing aside the unease that gnawed at his gut. It's just a game. It can't hurt. He selected the celestial fountain, dragged it to the center of his virtual orchard, and tapped the confirmation button. The screen flashed with a soft golden light, and a cheerful chime played. A new notification appeared: celestial fountain placed. Plus 150 aesthetic points. Hydration meter maxed. Perfect orchard progress, 60%. Lin smiled, a genuine expression of pleasure spreading across his face. He watched as the pixelated fountain began to animate on screen, tiny droplets of water arcing gracefully through the air. The hydration meter, which had been hovering at 75%, now glowed a satisfying green at 100%. He imagined the virtual fruit trees drinking deeply, growing lusher and more productive. For a long while, he simply stood there, scrolling through his orchard, admiring how the fountain completed the layout. The morning sun climbed higher, warming his back through the thin fabric of his tunic. The chicken clucked contentedly, finding a worm in the ash. Villagers continued their cleanup, their voices a distant murmur. Lin was so engrossed in his game that he didn't notice the subtle shift in the air, a faint dampness that hadn't been there before, a distant sound like rushing water that was too far away to be the river that bordered the county. He didn't see the way the smoke from the forest fires began to thin as if being pressed down by invisible moisture. He was completely unaware that, 200 miles to the east, in the heart of the rival dukedom of Torrent, reality was rewriting itself. The dukedom of Torrent had earned its name from the fierce river that cut through its territory, its waters controlled by elaborate systems of dams and canals engineered over generations. The capital city, Torrent's heart, was built around the river's central bend, its stone buildings rising in terraced levels, connected by arched bridges that hummed with the constant flow of water. Duke Alastair of Torrent stood on his balcony overlooking the central plaza, a goblet of wine in hand. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. His robes were embroidered with water motifs, swirling patterns of blue and silver thread that caught the morning light. Below him, the city bustled with activity, merchants setting up stalls, children chasing each other through the streets, guards patrolling the bridges. The reports from Dust County are troubling, his advisor, a thin man named Corvin, said from behind him. The Azure Sky sect investigator spoke of golden fields and an empty manor. And now there are rumors of a phoenix manifestation. Duke Alistair took a sip of wine. Divine energy surges. Portents. Let the cultivators and gods worry about such things. Our concern is trade. With Lord Kale's family gone, their grain monopoly collapses. We should move quickly to secure. He never finished the sentence. A sound like tearing silk filled the air, followed by a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the stone of the balcony. The Duke's goblet trembled in his hand, wine sloshing over the rim. In the center of the plaza below, the air shimmered like heat haze over desert sands. Then, with a flash of golden light that left afterimages dancing in everyone's vision, it appeared. The celestial fountain materialized fully formed, as if it had always been there. It was massive, 30 feet tall, carved from what appeared to be luminous white marble veined with threads of gold. 3 tiers rose in elegant curves, each adorned with intricate carvings of celestial beings, winged figures pouring water from urns, dragons coiled around pillars, stars and moons etched into the stone. At the very top, a sphere of crystal hovered without support, spinning slowly as it glowed with inner light. For a breathless moment, there was silence. The city froze, every eye fixed on the impossible structure that had appeared without warning in their midst. Then the waters began to flow. They erupted from the fountain's top tier not in a gentle cascade, but in a roaring torrent. Crystal clear water gushed forth with impossible pressure, arcing high into the air before crashing down into the basin below. But the basin didn't contain it. The water overflowed immediately, flooding across the stone plaza, sweeping market stalls off their feet, knocking people from their feet. What in the 9 hells, Duke Alistair began, but his words were drowned out by the growing roar. The fountain didn't just flow, it multiplied. Every drop that hit the ground seemed to generate more water, as if the very concept of dry was being rewritten. The central plaza became a lake within minutes. The water rushed down side streets, climbed staircases, poured through windows. It ignored physics, flowing uphill as easily as down, seeking every crevice and hollow. Panic erupted. People screamed, scrambling for higher ground. Horses reared, their cries lost in the deluge. Guards tried to form barriers, but the water simply flowed around them, over them, through them. The intricate canal system, designed to handle the river's flow, was overwhelmed instantly. The dams strained, then cracked, adding the river's fury to the magical flood. Duke Alistair watched in horror as his city drowned. From his balcony, he saw the waters rise, first ankle-deep, then knee-deep, then waist-deep. Stone buildings that had stood for centuries began to groan as water pressed against their foundations. Bridges vanished beneath the surface. The central plaza became a whirlpool, the fountain at its heart spinning like a demented top, throwing off spray that glimmered with unnatural light. "My lord, we must evacuate," Corvin shouted, grabbing the Duke's arm. But Duke Alistair shook him off, his storm-cloud eyes fixed on the fountain. He saw something in its design, the celestial carvings, the golden veins, the impossible geometry. This wasn't natural. This wasn't some freak weather event or broken dam. "This is an attack," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "A deliberate assault on my dukedom." He turned, water now lapping at the balcony floor, soaking the hem of his robes. "Gather my personal guard. And find me the water-wielding cultivator responsible for this. I don't care what sect they belong to or what god they serve. I want their head." Back in the County of Dust, Lynn was happily harvesting virtual fruits. His smartphone chimed with each successful tap, apples, pears, moon peaches piling up in his inventory. The hydration meter remained gloriously maxed out, and the aesthetic points had pushed his perfect orchard progress to 65%. He sat on a fallen timber that had once been part of his hut, the chicken nestled beside him. The sun was high now, and the air had grown strangely humid. Lin wiped sweat from his brow, attributing it to the unseasonable warmth. Old man Juan hobbled over, leaning on his walking stick. "Strange weather," the elderly villager remarked, squinting at the sky. Feels like a storm's brewing, but there's not a cloud to be seen. May approached from her plot, her brow furrowed. The river's running higher than I've ever seen it. And the forest fires, they're all out. Just like that. As if the flames were drowned where they stood. Lin glanced up from his game, a flicker of unease returning. But then his smartphone chimed again, a new quest notification. Expand orchard to adjacent plots for bonus yield. He pushed the unease aside. The game was just so satisfying. The simple mechanics, the clear goals, the sense of progress, it was everything his real life wasn't. He didn't know that 200 miles away, the dukedom of Torrent was now a submerged ruin. That Duke Alistair stood on the highest remaining tower of his castle, watching the waters churn below, his face a mask of cold fury. That the Duke's personal assassins, 3 figures in water-repellent leathers, their movements fluid and silent, were already gathering supplies, studying maps, preparing for a journey to find the source of the magical flood. Lin didn't know that the assassins' orders were explicit: find the water-wielding cultivator, extract every detail of their technique, then bring back their head as proof. That Duke Alistair had promised lands and titles to whoever succeeded. All Lin knew was that his virtual orchard was coming along nicely. He selected the expansion tool, tapped to claim the adjacent plot, and watched as pixelated trees began to sprout. The chicken clucked approvingly. Somewhere in the distance, a bird took flight, its wings beating against the humid air. Lin didn't look up. He was too busy planning where to place his next decorative structure, maybe a starlight gazebo, or a path of whispering stones. The achievement was so close he could almost taste it. And far to the east, in the flooded ruins of a dukedom, waters continued to rise. The morning after the floodwaters had receded from the dukedom of Torrent, though Lin knew nothing of this, a peculiar stillness settled over the county of Dust. The air, usually thick with the scent of dry earth and peasant sweat, now carried the faint, lingering sweetness of spirit-rich grain that had somehow survived the phoenix's fiery tantrum. Lin sat on the charred remains of what had once been his hut's front step, the blackened wood groaning under his weight. His fingers traced the smooth surface of the glowing slate in his lap, its pixelated display showing a cheerful orchard layout with 87% completion. He had spent the early hours trying to salvage what he could from the wreckage. The Phoenix incident had left his field a patchwork of scorched earth and miraculously untouched golden stalks, the latter swaying gently as if unaware of the destruction around them. Old Man Juan had come by at dawn, his wrinkled face pale with awe as he pointed at the surviving grain. Never seen anything like it, the elder had whispered, touching one of the golden stalks reverently. Fire should have turned this to ash. It's like the flames respected the grain. Lin had only nodded, his throat tight. He knew better. The flames hadn't respected anything, they'd been contained by his frantic tapping on the containment puzzle before they could consume everything. Now, as he scrolled through his game's interface, he noticed a new notification: environmental damage detected. Orchard aesthetics -15%. Recommend decorative placement to restore points. He sighed, rubbing his temples. The game kept giving him problems to solve, but the solutions kept causing other problems. Real problems. The vanished plague, the erased noble family, the phoenix, the mysterious maxed-out hydration meter, they couldn't all be coincidences. Could they? A distant shimmer caught his eye. 3 figures approached from the eastern road, moving with an unnatural grace that made the dust barely stir beneath their feet. They wore robes of pale blue and silver, their garments flowing as if touched by a breeze that didn't exist. Lin squinted. Cultivators. He'd seen them before, flying overhead on glowing swords after the plague disappeared. Now they were here, on foot, and heading straight for his village. He watched as they reached the first cluster of huts. May, the young peasant from the neighboring plot, emerged from her doorway, a basket of laundry in her hands. She froze when she saw the cultivators, her eyes widening. One of them, a woman with hair tied in an elaborate silver knot, spoke to her. Lin was too far to hear the words, but he saw May gesture wildly toward his field, then toward the empty manor where Lord Kale's family had vanished. The cultivators listened intently, their expressions unreadable. Then they began moving again, this time directly toward Lin's ruined plot. Lin's heart hammered against his ribs. He considered hiding, but there was nowhere to go, his hut was a charcoal skeleton, and the field offered no cover. Instead, he clutched the slate tighter, its glow warming his palms. Maybe they were just passing through. Maybe they wouldn't notice him. They noticed him. The three cultivators stopped at the edge of his field, their eyes sweeping over the scorched earth, the surviving golden grain, and finally settling on Lin. The woman who had spoken to May stepped forward. Up close, Lin could see the intricate silver embroidery on her robes, patterns that seemed to shift and shimmer when he looked at them too long. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, cold and assessing. "Peasant," she said, her voice carrying an odd resonance that made the air hum. "We are investigators from the Azure Sky sect. We seek the source of divine energy surges in this county." Lin swallowed. "Divine energy. Miracles," clarified a male cultivator standing slightly behind her. He was younger, with sharp features and a hand resting on the hilt of a sword that glowed with faint blue light. "The golden grain that grows in barren soil. The plague that vanished overnight. The noble family erased from existence. These are not natural events." I don't know anything about that," Lin said, his voice barely above a whisper. He could feel the slate pulsing in his hands, as if responding to the cultivator's presence. The woman's eyes narrowed. She raised a hand, and Lin felt a strange pressure in the air, like invisible fingers probing at the space around him. "There is residual energy here," she murmured. "Faint, but potent. Ancient. Like the breath of creation itself." Her gaze dropped to the slate in Lin's hands. "What is that device?" Lin's mind raced. He couldn't tell them the truth, that it was a game that somehow changed reality. They'd think he was mad. Or worse, they'd take it from him. It's just a tool," he stammered. "For farming." The younger cultivator snorted. "A farming tool that glows with unearthly light? Let me see it." He took a step forward, and panic surged through Lin. Without thinking, Lin looked down at the slate. The game's interface had changed. Where there had been orchard layouts, now there was a dialog box with 3 options, floating above pixelated representations of the 3 cultivators. The text read, "Azure Sky Sect investigators have arrived. How will you respond?" Option 1, greet them warmly. Option 2, demand they state their business. Option 3, ignore them and return to farming. Lin blinked. Game NPCs. That's what they were. Just like the villagers who sometimes gave him quests. Relief washed over him, followed by a strange detachment. If they were game characters, then this was just another interaction. Nothing to worry about. His finger hovered over the options. Option 1 seemed too friendly, they were suspicious of him. Option 3 was rude, and might make them angry. Option 2. That seemed appropriate. Firm, but not hostile. He tapped it. As his finger connected with the glass surface, the slate flared with golden light so bright that Lin had to squeeze his eyes shut. When he opened them, the world had changed. The air crackled with energy. The golden grain in his field glowed as if lit from within, each stalk emitting a soft, pulsing light. The cultivators staggered back, their eyes wide with shock. The woman raised her hands in a defensive gesture, silver energy swirling around her fingers. And then Lin's voice boomed across the field, but it wasn't his voice, not really. It was deeper, resonant, layered with echoes that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The words were the ones he'd selected, demand they state their business. But they didn't sound like a demand. They sounded like a command from something ancient and terrible. The very ground trembled with each syllable. Birds fell silent in the distance. The few villagers who had been watching from a safe distance dropped to their knees, covering their ears. The cultivator's composure shattered. The younger man's sword clattered to the ground, its glow extinguished. The woman's silver energy dissipated like mist in sunlight. All 3 of them dropped to one knee, their heads bowed so low their foreheads nearly touched the dirt. "Forgive us, Divine One," the woman cried, her voice trembling. "We did not mean to intrude upon your testing ground." Lin stared, his mouth hanging open. "Testing ground? Divine One?" He looked at the slate. The dialog box was gone, replaced by a new notification, interaction successful. Cultivators pacified. Reward, Spirit Stones X50. Before he could process this, the cultivators were moving again, not toward him, but away. They rose unsteadily, keeping their eyes averted from Lin as if direct gaze might burn them. The woman reached into a pouch at her belt and withdrew 3 small, smooth stones that glowed with inner light. She placed them carefully on a relatively unscorched patch of earth, then backed away, bowing repeatedly. "We offer these spirit stones as tribute," she said, her voice still shaking. "May they please you, and may our sect be found worthy of your attention." With that, they turned and fled, moving faster than Lin had ever seen humans move. Within seconds, they were specks on the eastern road, then gone entirely. Silence returned to the field, broken only by the rustle of grain in the breeze. Lin slowly walked over to where the stones lay. They were about the size of his thumb, cool to the touch, and pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light. He picked one up, and immediately felt a strange warmth spread through his hand. The slate buzzed, and another notification appeared: spirit stones acquired. Energy source detected. Would you like to convert to in-game currency? He declined for now, slipping the stones into his pocket. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion. They'd thought he was a god. A divine being testing them. And all he'd done was tap a dialogue option. As he turned to go back to what remained of his hut, something fluttered on the ground where the cultivators had knelt. A scroll, rolled tightly and tied with a silver cord. One of them must have dropped it in their haste to leave. Lin picked it up, untied the cord, and unrolled the parchment. It was a map, drawn in intricate ink lines that seemed to shift slightly when he looked at them. The script was ancient, but somehow he could read it: Tomb of the Fallen Divinity. Location of god-slaying artifacts. Enter at your peril. A red X marked a spot deep in the mountains to the north, far beyond the County of Dust. Along the margins, someone had written notes in a hurried hand: Sect Master believes this may be key to understanding new divine presence. Artifacts rumored to be able to challenge even true gods. Lin stared at the map, then at his slate. The game's interface had changed again, now showing a new quest notification: Ancient Dungeon discovered. Explore the Tomb of the Fallen Divinity for rare loot and achievements. He rolled the scroll back up, his fingers trembling slightly. God-slaying artifacts. A Tomb of Fallen Divinity. This wasn't just game loot, this was something real, something dangerous. And the cultivators thought he was the god who needed slaying. In the distance, the first shadows of evening began to stretch across the scarred landscape. Somewhere far to the west, 3 assassins from the dukedom of Torrent continued their journey, asking questions in taverns and roadhouses about water-wielding cultivators. And in the heavens above, a regional god stirred from divine slumber, sensing yet another ripple in the fabric of creation, this one carrying the distinct flavor of terrified cultivators and misplaced tribute. Lin knew none of this. He only knew that he had a new quest, a pocket full of glowing stones, and a growing certainty that his cozy farm sim was about to get much, much more complicated. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ruined remains of Lin's hut. He sat on a fallen beam, the smartphone glowing softly in his hands. The map from the cultivators, or rather, the game loot he'd picked up, lay unfolded beside him. Its parchment was yellowed with age, marked with faded ink that depicted winding paths leading to a structure labeled Tomb of the Fallen Divinity, in elegant, looping script. To Lin, it looked exactly like the dungeon entrances in his game, pixelated and promising adventure. He traced a finger over the map's surface. The estate it marked wasn't far, just a day's walk northwest, in what had once been the lands of the Kale family. Lin remembered hearing whispers about them as a child. Corrupt nobles, people said, who'd mysteriously vanished overnight. Now, according to the game interface that popped up when he examined the map, it was a dungeon level, waiting to be cleared. A new quest notification blinked cheerfully: Explore the ancient estate. Clear corruption to unlock rewards. Lin packed a small satchel with dried grain and a water skin, his movements methodical. He didn't think about the cultivators who'd fled from him, or the flood that had reportedly devastated a neighboring dukedom, or even the phoenix that had nearly incinerated his county. Those were just coincidences. Strange weather patterns, maybe. His focus was on the game. The perfect orchard achievement still glowed tantalizingly incomplete in his inventory, and this dungeon might offer the final aesthetic points he needed. The walk took him through scorched forests, remnants of the phoenix's brief rampage. Blackened tree trunks stood like skeletal sentinels, their branches clawing at a sky still hazy with lingering smoke. Lin barely noticed. He hummed a tuneless melody, his mind on the puzzle mechanics he'd need to use. The match 3 dungeon cleanse mode had been unlocked after he'd cleared the plague, but he'd never tried it in a dedicated dungeon setting. He wondered if there'd be bonus multipliers for speed. By late afternoon, the estate came into view. It was a sprawling complex of grey stone walls, their surfaces cracked and veined with dark moss. Towers rose like broken teeth against the sky, their roofs collapsed inward. The main gate hung askew on rusted hinges, leading into a courtyard choked with weeds and shattered statuary. To anyone else, it would have looked like a monument to decay and forgotten power. To Lin, it looked like perfect dungeon design. He stepped through the gate, the crunch of gravel under his boots echoing in the stillness. The air inside was cold and thick with the scent of damp stone and something else, something metallic and sour, like old blood. Lin shivered, but not from fear. The game's ambient music had switched to a low, ominous synth track, complete with occasional creaking sound effects. Immersion is really good, he thought approvingly, tapping his smartphone to bring up the dungeon interface. A mini-map appeared in the corner of the screen, showing the estate's layout in clean, pixelated lines. Red dots pulsed in various rooms, labeled corruption nodes. Lin's first objective, according to the quest log, was to clear the entrance hall. He moved forward, his footsteps careful on the uneven flagstones. The hall was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows high above. Tattered tapestries hung from the walls, their colors faded to grays and browns. In the center of the room, a spectral figure materialized. It was humanoid but translucent, its features blurred and shifting. Lin recognized the ornate robes from village tales, the Kale family insignia, a coiled serpent, was just visible on its chest. The figure didn't speak. It simply raised a hand, and the air grew colder, frost spreading across the floor in jagged patterns. Lin didn't hesitate. He opened the dungeon cleanse puzzle on his phone. The screen filled with a grid of colorful gems, red, blue, green, yellow, and purple. The objective, as always, was to match 3 or more of the same color in a row or column. But here, each gem was labeled with tiny icons, a broken chain, a fading curse symbol, a dissipating mist. Lin swiped his finger, aligning 3 green gems. They vanished with a satisfying pop, and a counter at the top of the screen ticked down, corruption level, 98%. In the real world, the spectral figure shuddered. Its form grew more transparent, the cold in the air less biting. Lin didn't look up from his phone. He was focused on the puzzle, his brow furrowed in concentration. He found a chain of 4 blue gems, swiped them away. Corruption level, 95%. Each match burned a bit of his in-game stamina bar, a green meter that slowly drained with every swipe. Lin had learned to manage it, he'd spent hours grinding in the fields, after all. He planned his moves carefully, setting up cascading combos. 5 red gems vanished in a chain reaction, followed by 3 yellows. Corruption level, 89%. The spectral figure let out a soundless scream, its form dissolving into motes of pale light that scattered like dust in a sunbeam. As it faded, the room around Lin changed. The frost on the floor melted away, leaving the stones clean and dry. The tapestries on the walls seemed to brighten, their colors returning, deep blues and rich golds, depicting scenes of harvest and celebration. The sour metallic scent lifted, replaced by the faint aroma of polished wood and lavender. Lin glanced up briefly. Nice graphics update, he thought, then returned to his phone. The mini-map showed the red dot in the entrance hall gone, replaced by a green checkmark. 1 room cleared. He moved deeper into the estate. The next room was a library. Bookshelves lined the walls, but they were empty, their contents long since rotted away or stolen. Here, 2 spectral figures waited, a man and a woman in noble attire, their faces contorted in silent rage. They moved faster than the first, their forms flickering across the room. Lin felt a pressure in his chest, a cold that seeped into his bones. He ignored it, tapping open the puzzle interface. This grid was larger, with more gems and a timer counting down from 60 seconds. Lin's fingers flew over the screen. Match, match, match. Each swipe made the pressure in his chest ease slightly. The spectral figures wavered, their movements slowing. Lin found a lucky alignment, 5 purple gems in an L shape. They vanished in a shower of pixelated sparks, and the timer froze, granting him a 5-second bonus. Corruption level, 75%. He cleared the rest of the grid just as the timer hit 0. The two figures dissolved, their light fading into the shelves. And as they did, the library transformed. Books reappeared on the shelves, their leather bindings whole and gleaming. A fireplace in the corner crackled to life with warm, golden flames. The air grew comfortably warm, carrying the scent of old paper and ink. Lin smiled. This is actually relaxing, he thought, stretching his fingers. The in-game stamina bar was half empty now, but he had a few recovery items, virtual energy drinks he'd crafted from harvested fruits. He used one, watching the green meter refill slightly. Then he moved on. Room by room, he worked his way through the estate. A banquet hall where spectral nobles sat at a rotting table, cleared with a tricky puzzle that required matching gems in specific patterns. A armory where ghostly soldiers clashed in silent combat, cleared with a rapid-fire series of matches that left Lin's fingers aching. A garden courtyard overrun with thorny, black vines, cleared with a puzzle that used plant-themed gems. Each time, the reality around him shifted. Curses lifted. Decay reversed. Colors returned. The estate was being restored, not to its former state of corruption, but to something purer. Cleaner. The stones gleamed as if newly cut. Windows cleared of grime, letting in shafts of afternoon sunlight. Furniture reassembled itself, upholstery plush and unworn. Lin barely noticed the scale of the change. To him, it was just good game design, a visual reward for completing objectives. His stamina bar dipped dangerously low. He used his last energy drink, but it only brought it to a quarter full. The final room, according to the mini-map, was the master bedchamber. It lay at the top of a grand staircase, its doors carved with intricate scenes of serpents and crowns. Lin pushed them open. The room was large, dominated by a canopied bed whose curtains hung in tatters. Here, the corruption was thickest. Dozens of spectral figures crowded the space, not just the Kale family, but servants, guards, all erased from existence by Lin's earlier puzzle solving. They were a seething mass of translucent forms, their silent screams filling the air with a pressure that made Lin's ears pop. The cold was intense, frosting his breath. Dark tendrils of energy coiled across the floor, pulsing with malevolent light. Lin's smartphone buzzed urgently. The Dungeon Cleanse puzzle that loaded was the largest yet, a massive grid that filled the entire screen, gems scrolling endlessly. The corruption level read 99%. The stamina bar flashed red, warning of imminent depletion. Lin took a deep breath. This was the boss fight. He'd faced tough puzzles before, the plague clearance had taken hours of grinding. He settled onto a newly restored velvet chair near the door, his focus absolute. He started swiping. Match after match, combo after combo. His stamina bar drained faster here, each match costing double. At 10% stamina, he made a mistake, misaligned a swipe, breaking a potential chain. The spectral figures surged forward, their cold intensifying. Lin's fingers went numb. He shook them out, refocused. He found a pattern, matched the gems with curse symbols first, they gave bonus clears. He targeted them, his movements becoming a rhythm. Swipe, pop, swipe, pop. The corruption level ticked down. 90%. 80%. 70%. The spectral figures thinned, their forms growing faint. The dark tendrils on the floor retracted, dissolving into nothing. Lin's stamina hit 5%. He was sweating now, his heart pounding not from fear but from concentration. One last chain, a perfect alignment of 6 green gems in a diagonal. He swiped. The gems vanished. The grid cleared. Corruption level, 0% flashed across the screen, followed by a fanfare of triumphant chiptune music. A notification popped up, achievement unlocked, estate manager. Bonus, aesthetic points plus 500. Lin grinned. That might be enough for the perfect orchard. He closed the puzzle interface, looking up to see the room transformed. The spectral figures were gone. The bedchamber was pristine, the bed canopied in rich silk, tapestries depicting peaceful landscapes on the walls, a fire crackling in a marble hearth. The air was warm and smelled of sandalwood. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, painting golden rectangles on the polished floor. Lin stood, stretching his stiff muscles. He was about to check his achievement progress when the temperature in the room dropped again. Not the cold of the corruption, this was different. Deeper. Older. The fire in the hearth guttered, its flames turning a pale, sickly green. From the shadows in the corner of the room, a new figure coalesced. It was not spectral like the others. It was solid, but wrong, a man in ancient noble garb, his skin gray and withered, his eyes pits of darkness. He did not wear the Kale insignia. His robes were older, from a time before the county had borders. He took a step forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Lin blinked. Another enemy? But I cleared the corruption. He tapped his phone, but no puzzle interface appeared. The game showed the estate as fully purified, all quests complete. The figure spoke, its voice a dry rasp like parchment tearing. Who dares wield divine power in my tomb? Its head turned, those dark eyes fixing on Lin. I felt it, the touch of creation, rewriting what was. It raised a hand, and the green flames in the hearth leaped higher, casting twisted shadows across the walls. I am Vorin, last lord of this land, before even the gods named it. You have awakened me, little thief of fate. Lin stared. The figure didn't have a health bar or a puzzle indicator. It just stood there, looking angry. Lin wondered if this was a bug. Or maybe a hidden boss he hadn't unlocked yet. He took a step back, his grip tightening on the smartphone. Its screen glowed softly, reflecting in the figure's dark eyes. The figure, Vorin, smiled, a crack splitting its gray lips. Your tool, it sings with power. Give it to me, and I may let you leave, as dust. Lin didn't understand most of the words. But he understood the tone. Threat. Challenge. He glanced at his phone. The game was asking if he wanted to save his progress. He tapped yes. Then he looked back at Vorin, his mind already moving to the next objective. Maybe this was part of the Tomb of the Fallen Divinity map. Maybe he needed a different puzzle. But Vorin was already moving, his form shifting, growing larger, the shadows in the room deepening. The restored estate seemed to hold its breath, caught between Lin's divine rewriting and the awakening of something far older. The air in the restored estate chamber grew cold enough to make Lin's breath visible in faint puffs. He stood before the ghost of Lord Vorin, who floated several feet above the polished marble floor, his form shimmering with spectral energy that cast shifting shadows across the newly pristine walls. Vorin's appearance was that of a noble from an age long forgotten, his robes were of a cut Lin had never seen, embroidered with patterns that seemed to writhe when looked at directly, and his face held the haughty authority of someone who had once commanded lands and lives. Lin blinked, his fingers still resting on the smooth surface of his smartphone. The screen displayed the Estate Manager achievement notification, complete with pixelated fireworks and a cheerful chime that echoed oddly in the silent room. He hadn't expected a follow-up quest so soon, but the game was full of surprises. The ghost's manifestation had triggered a new dialogue box, Ancient Spirit Vorin offers a deal. Accept? Y/N. Vorin's voice echoed through the chamber, not through the air but directly in Lin's mind, a sensation like cold water trickling down his spine. Peasant, the ghost intoned, each syllable weighted with centuries of resentment. You wield the power to reshape reality itself. I have watched you cleanse this place of the upstart Kale family's taint. Now, use that same power for me. Resurrect my physical form, restore me to the flesh I once wore, and I shall grant you treasures beyond your meager imagination. Lin tilted his head, studying the ghost. The game interface helpfully displayed Vorin's offer as a series of icons, a glowing resurrection symbol on one side, a chest overflowing with gold and jewels on the other. It looked like one of those negotiation minigames he'd encountered before, the kind where you had to match offerings to get better rewards. He'd always been decent at those puzzles, though the timing could be tricky. What kind of treasures? Lin asked aloud, more out of habit than actual curiosity. In the game, these dialogue choices sometimes unlocked hidden loot paths. Vorin's form solidified slightly, a cruel smile touching his translucent lips. The vaults beneath this estate hold artifacts from before the gods named these lands. Weapons that could slay immortals, scrolls containing forbidden knowledge, gems that pulse with the essence of creation itself. All yours, if you but grant me life again. The ghost gestured, and the floor at the chamber's center shimmered, revealing a hidden staircase descending into darkness. Lin could almost imagine the pixelated treasure chests waiting down there. But something about the negotiation interface felt off. The resurrection icon kept flickering, as if the game was warning him it was a bad trade. He remembered the Plague Eradicator achievement he'd unlocked earlier. Sometimes the game rewarded you more for solving problems than for making deals. Lin's thumb hovered over the screen. The negotiation minigame had presented him with 3 options: accept deal, counteroffer, and refuse and banish. The last option was grayed out initially but had just lit up, probably because he'd hesitated. It showed a puzzle icon, a quick match, 3 game that would cost no resources according to the tooltip. That sounded efficient. Lin hated when quests drained his in-game currency. I don't know, Lin said, mostly to himself. Resurrection sounds complicated. And the last time I messed with life and death stuff, I got that phoenix instead of a chicken. Voron's patience evaporated. Do not test me, mortal. I was a lord when your ancestors were scraping dirt from riverbanks. My power may be diminished, but I can still. The ghost's form surged forward, cold tendrils of energy reaching for Lin's throat. That settled it. Lin tapped, refuse and banish. The smartphone screen immediately shifted to a puzzle grid filled with colored orbs, red, blue, green, and gold. Lin's focus narrowed to the familiar mechanics. Swap this orb with that one, create a chain of 4 gold orbs for maximum effect. His fingers moved with practiced ease, the soft taps echoing in the chamber. He didn't notice how the air began to hum with power, how the restored marble walls started glowing with faint golden light. Voron screamed, but the sound was cut off as golden chains erupted from Lin's smartphone. They weren't physical chains but constructs of pure light, woven from the same divine energy that had rewritten the estate's corruption. Each link glowed with intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. The chains shot through the air, wrapping around Voron's spectral form with impossible speed. What is this? The ghost shrieked, struggling against bonds that tightened with each passing second. This power, it shouldn't be possible. No mortal wields creation itself. Lin completed the puzzle with a satisfying 3-chain combo. The game chimed cheerfully. Banishment successful. Reward, sealed spirit gem added to inventory. The golden chains constricted, pulling Voron into a tight sphere of light. The ghost's form compressed, his screams fading to whispers, then to silence. The sphere shrank further, condensing into a single point of brilliant light that shot back toward Lin's smartphone. It struck the screen and vanished, leaving behind only a new inventory icon, a gemstone with a faint, swirling mist inside. Lin pocketed the phone, satisfied. Another quest completed, another item for his collection. He didn't notice the faint tremor that ran through the device, nor the hairline crack that appeared at the top right corner of the screen, so thin it was almost invisible, like a spider's thread against glass. The crack didn't affect the display yet, but it pulsed with a faint, sickly light for just a moment before fading. Around him, the chamber felt different. Warmer. The oppressive cold had vanished along with Voron, replaced by the gentle warmth of afternoon sunlight streaming through the restored windows. Dust motes danced in the beams, and somewhere outside, a bird began to sing. The hidden staircase had vanished, the floor seamless once more. Lin stretched, his back popping from standing too long. He should probably head back to his fields. The in-game hydration meter was still maxed out from that fountain placement, and he had virtual fruits to harvest. But first, he pulled out his smartphone again to check the new gem in his inventory. The screen lit up normally, the crack barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. The gem's description read, Sealed Spirit Gem, contains the essence of ancient noble Voron. May have uses in advanced crafting or trade. Neat, Lin murmured. Maybe he could trade it for some rare seeds later. The game's marketplace sometimes had special events. He turned to leave, his footsteps echoing in the empty estate. Behind him, the chamber remained perfectly restored, no trace of the ghost or the confrontation. But if Lin had looked more carefully at his smartphone screen, if he'd tilted it just right in the sunlight, he might have seen how the crack seemed to drink in the light, how it pulsed faintly with each touch of his fingers. A tiny flaw in the divine interface, the first strain from rewriting too much reality too quickly. For now, Lin remained blissfully unaware. He had a perfect orchard to finish, and that wouldn't build itself. The morning sun painted Lin's small hut in warm gold, but the usual quiet of the county of dust had been shattered since dawn. Lin rubbed his eyes, blinking at the strange sounds drifting through his window, not the familiar rustle of spirit-rich grain or old man Juan's morning cough, but a cacophony of roars, screeches, and low, rumbling growls that vibrated through the packed earth floor. He stumbled outside, still clutching his smartphone. The glowing slate felt warm against his palm, a comforting weight amid the growing chaos. What he saw made him freeze mid-yawn. The village square, usually occupied by a few chickens pecking at scattered grain, had transformed into something from a traveling bard's wildest tale. A dozen massive creatures stood tethered to hastily erected posts, their forms shifting between solid flesh and shimmering energy. A scaled beast with 6 legs snorted plumes of frost that crystallized the morning dew on nearby rooftops. A winged serpent coiled around the old well, its feathers iridescent in the sunlight. And at the center of it all, a group of people dressed in leather and furs moved with practiced ease among the creatures, their hands glowing with faint runes as they calmed restless beasts. Lin's own chicken, the one that had somehow turned into a phoenix and then back again, was strutting nervously near his hut, its ordinary brown feathers looking absurdly plain next to the mythical menagerie. Old man Juan stood nearby, leaning on his walking stick, his wrinkled face a mask of bewildered awe. May had joined him, her hands clasped tightly together as she watched a beast tamer soothe a creature with 3 heads, each maw dripping something that smelled like burnt ozone. Lin. May called out, her voice barely audible over a creature's piercing cry. They're asking for you. Before Lin could process this, a figure detached from the group and approached. He was an older man, his face lined with years spent under open skies, his hair streaked with gray and braided with what looked like small bones. He wore a cloak made from a pelt that shifted colors as he moved, one moment forest green, the next storm gray. Behind him followed 2 younger individuals, a woman with sharp eyes who kept glancing at the creatures with professional assessment, and a man whose hands never stopped moving, tracing patterns in the air that made nearby beasts settle. I am Elder Kalen, the older man said, his voice carrying the weight of authority without needing to shout. We come from the Storm Summit clans, keepers of the ancient pacts with earth and sky. He bowed slightly, a gesture that seemed both respectful and wary. We seek the divine chicken that was witnessed transforming into a phoenix 3 days past. Our scouts reported the event, a creature of ordinary form touched by celestial fire, reborn in glory. Lin blinked. In his mind, he was already tapping through his smartphone's interface, pulling up the game's quest log. There it was, pet management screen, showing his chicken's pixelated sprite with a little crown icon next to it. The game called it Special Event Pet, Phoenix Variant, Temporary, . Below that, a new notification blinked, clan delegation arrived. Manage your coop to impress visitors. Lin said intelligently. He held up his smartphone, the screen glowing softly. It's just my chicken. From the game. Elder Kalen's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in intense focus. He didn't seem to see the smartphone as a strange artifact, perhaps he thought it was some kind of focusing crystal or divine tool. The beast-taming clans have kept records for millennia, he said slowly. When a creature manifests divine attributes without cultivation, without bloodline rituals, it signifies either a great blessing or a portent of upheaval. We have brought tributes. He gestured behind him. The younger woman stepped forward. I am Lyra, she said, her voice crisp. This is Torin. The man with the moving hands nodded without looking away from a creature that was trying to chew through its tether. We've brought specimens from our breeding grounds, a frostwalker from the northern glaciers, a sky serpent egg that hatches only under true sunlight, a shadow prowler cub that can phase through solid matter. As if on cue, the shadow prowler, a sleek feline creature with fur that drank the light, suddenly vanished from its post and reappeared next to Lin's chicken. The chicken squawked in alarm, flapping its wings as the shadow prowler sniffed it curiously. The other beasts, sensing the disturbance, began to grow restless. The frostwalker stamped its 6 feet, cracking the ground with ice. The sky serpent uncoiled from the well, its wings snapping open with a sound like tearing silk. Chaos erupted. Villagers who had been watching from a distance scattered as the frostwalker's breath froze a cart solid. The sky serpent took to the air, circling low enough that its wing beats whipped up dust devils. The 3-headed beast strained against its bonds, all 3 mouths roaring in different pitches. Elder Kalen barked orders, his hands glowing with runes that spread through the air like golden nets, but there were too many creatures, too much primal energy reacting to the perceived threat to the divine chicken. Lin backed against his hut, his heart pounding. This wasn't in the game tutorial. The pet management screen was still open on his smartphone, showing a messy pixelated coop with animals overlapping each other, little stress icons popping up above their heads. The interface offered a button, Organize Co-op, below it, a simple puzzle, drag and drop the animals into their proper pens based on color and type. A timer counted down, 30 seconds before Coop Chaos reaches critical levels. Right, Lin muttered to himself, his fingers already moving. Just a minigame. Just organize the thing. He tapped the Frostwalker's pixel icon, dragged it to a blue-tinted pen. The real Frostwalker in the square suddenly stopped stamping, its icy breath ceasing mid-exhalation. It blinked, then lay down with a contented rumble, curling up as if for a nap. Lin didn't notice, he was already tapping the sky serpent icon, sliding it to a pen marked with wing symbols. The serpent in the air folded its wings and glided gently to the ground, coiling itself neatly around the well again without so much as a hiss. One by one, he sorted the pixel creatures. Each drag-and-drop action made his smartphone vibrate softly, and with each vibration, a wave of invisible energy pulsed outward. It wasn't loud or flashy, just a sudden settling, like the moment after a storm passes. The beasts calmed. Their restless movements stilled. Even the shadow prowler stopped phasing and sat obediently next to Lin's chicken, which had puffed up its feathers importantly. But Lin's focus was entirely on the puzzle. The game required him to match the creatures not just by type, but by elemental affinity, a mechanic he'd barely glanced at before. He misdragged the three-headed beast initially, putting it in a fire affinity pen when it belonged in Earth. The timer ticked down to 10 seconds. On the screen, a warning flashed, Coop organization incomplete. Upgrade available to optimize space. Without thinking, Lin tapped the upgrade button that appeared. It cost 50 in-game energy, he had 120 left after sealing Vorin yesterday. The screen flashed gold, and a new pen appeared with divine symbols around it. The game prompted, place divine affinity pet in upgraded coop for bonus rewards. Lin dragged his chicken's pixel icon into the new pen. The effect was immediate and profound. In the square, Lin's ordinary brown chicken suddenly straightened. Its feathers began to glow from within, not with the fiery brilliance of the phoenix transformation, but with a steady, golden light that seemed to emanate from its very bones. It grew, not massively, but enough that it stood taller than any rooster Lin had ever seen. Its comb turned metallic gold, each point sharp like a tiny crown. Its eyes gained depth, pupils swirling with miniature constellations. And when it opened its beak, the sound that emerged wasn't a cock's crow, but a clear, resonant note that hung in the air like a struck bell. The note spread. Where it touched, reality softened at the edges. A patch of bare earth near the chicken sprouted flowers that hadn't bloomed in the county of dust for generations, silver-petaled night blooms that should only open under moonlight, yet here they were, unfolding in morning sun. The well water, usually brackish and low, rose to the brim, crystal clear and faintly shimmering. Even the villagers who had fled stopped in their tracks, turning back with expressions of wonder, their fear washed away by that single, perfect sound. Lin stared at his smartphone. The screen now showed his chicken with a new title, Divine Rooster, Permanent Upgrade, Stats scrolled beside it, reality-altering crow, can temporarily soften local physics. Coop calming aura, pacifies all nearby creatures. Divine affinity, high. His in-game energy had dropped to 70. He'd solved the puzzle with 2 seconds left on the timer. Silence fell over the square, a deep, reverent silence broken only by the gentle snoring of the Frostwalker. Elder Kalen stood motionless, his hands still half-raised, the golden runes fading from the air. He looked from the divine rooster to Lin, then back again. His expression shifted through layers of realization, confusion, awe, dawning understanding. He sank to one knee. Not a quick bow, but a full kneel, his head bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the earth. Behind him, Lyra and Torin followed immediately, their movements synchronized in practiced ritual. The other beast tamers, Lin counted 8 more he hadn't noticed before, tending to creatures at the square's edges, all knelt as well. Beast God, Elder Kalen whispered, the words carrying in the stillness. Forgive our ignorance. We thought we sought a blessed creature, but we have found the source of the blessing itself. Lin opened his mouth to say something, to explain it was just a game, just a phone, just a weird chicken, but Elder Kalen continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. The clans have legends of the first tamer, who walked among beasts as equals and whose voice could calm the wildest storm. We thought them myths. But here is the proof. He looked up, his eyes shining with something Lin couldn't quite identify, not fear, not worship, but a fierce, almost desperate hope. You have pacified creatures that take years of ritual to approach. You have transformed a common fowl into a divine herald. The Storm Summit clans pledge allegiance. We will spread word to the other clans, the Stone Grip, the River Song, the Sky Reacher. A new beast god walks the earth. As he spoke, Lin noticed something on his smartphone screen. A tiny notification icon pulsed in the corner, a message symbol. He tapped it. A system alert appeared, regional attention increased. Divine awareness, 65%. Warning, high awareness may attract scrutiny from local divine authorities. Far away, in a realm where mountains floated above clouds and rivers ran with liquid light, a being older than nations stirred from meditation. He was known as the god of verdant growth, keeper of the region's natural cycles. For days now, he had felt disturbances, ripples in creation that didn't match any known deity signature. The vanishing plague. The sudden spirit grain. The sealed ghost. And now, this. A surge of beast-taming divine energy, pure and untamed, emanating from the mortal village he'd been monitoring. He opened eyes that held forests within them. Suspicion, cold and sharp, crystallized in his divine consciousness. A new deity was operating in his territory. Not just any deity, one with power over beasts and reality itself, bypassing the established hierarchies. One who hadn't paid respects. Hadn't announced themselves. Hadn't followed the rules. In the County of Dust, Lin was trying to explain to a kneeling elder that he really wasn't a god, just a peasant with a weird phone. But Elder Kalen wasn't listening, he was already gesturing to his followers, speaking in low, urgent tones about sending messenger birds to the other clans. About pilgrimage routes. About proper tributes for a living deity. And in his hand, Lin's smartphone glowed a little brighter, the hairline crack on its screen catching the light like a tiny lightning bolt frozen in glass. The morning after the beast-taming clan's departure dawned with an unusual stillness over the County of Dust. Lin stood in his newly expanded orchard, admiring the rows of pixel-perfect trees that had sprouted overnight, peach trees heavy with golden fruit, pear trees whose blossoms shimmered like cut crystal, and apple trees whose bark seemed to pulse with a soft, inner light. His smartphone rested in his palm, its screen displaying the perfect orchard progress bar at 78%. The hairline crack he'd noticed days earlier had grown slightly, a spiderweb of fine lines spreading from the upper right corner, but the device still functioned perfectly. He tapped the screen to harvest virtual peaches, watching as the in-game energy counter dropped from 70 to 65. Old Man Juan shuffled through the village square, his eyes wide with wonder at the transformed landscape. Where once there had been barren soil and struggling crops, now spirit-rich grain waved in gentle breezes, each stalk glowing with faint golden light. The divine rooster perched on the newly restored well, its feathers shimmering with iridescent hues. With each crow, flowers bloomed in impossible colors, sapphire blue roses, emerald green lilies, and crimson orchids that seemed to drink sunlight. The well water had become so pure that villagers reported drinking it cured minor ailments overnight. May approached Lin, her hands trembling as she held a basket of peaches that had fallen from his trees. "Lin," she whispered, "these fruits, they taste like memories of summer from childhood. How is this possible?" Lin shrugged, his attention divided between her and his smartphone. "Just good farming techniques," he said absently, tapping to complete a fertilize orchard minigame. In reality, the soil around his trees darkened with rich nutrients, and the air filled with the scent of blooming jasmine that hadn't grown in the county for generations. He didn't notice the gathering clouds. At first, they appeared as wisps of gold on the horizon, like distant fields of wheat catching sunset light. But they gathered with unnatural speed, swirling into a vortex that churned the sky above the village. The air grew heavy with the scent of ripe grain and turned earth, a smell so potent it made villagers cough and cover their noses. Birds fell silent mid-song. The divine rooster stopped its crowing and ruffled its feathers nervously. Then the wheat descended. Not rain, not snow, but stalks of golden wheat fell from the sky in a shimmering cascade, each grain glowing with divine energy. They didn't touch the ground, instead, they swirled in intricate patterns, weaving together to form a massive figure that towered over the village square. The wheat coalesced into a being 20 feet tall, with limbs of braided stalks, eyes that burned like harvest moons, and a crown of living grain that shifted and rustled with each movement. This was Lorien, god of harvests, regional deity of the fertile plains that included the county of Dust. His voice shook the earth when he spoke, each word carrying the weight of centuries and the promise of bounty. Who dares alter my domain? The wheat figure's gaze swept across the transformed village, taking in the spirit-rich grain, the blooming flowers, the purified well, and finally settling on Lin. What mortal presumes to wield divine power without offering? Villagers scattered, screaming. Old man Juan fell to his knees, pressing his forehead to the ground. May dropped her basket of peaches and backed away slowly, her eyes wide with terror. Even the divine rooster retreated behind the well, its magnificent feathers flattened against its body. Lin blinked up at the towering wheat god. In his mind, this wasn't a divine confrontation, it was clearly a boss battle. The pixelated health bar that appeared over Lorien's head confirmed it, glowing red with the label, Harvest Guardian, level. Perfect. He'd been hoping for a challenging encounter to earn more aesthetic points for his orchard. He opened his smartphone, his fingers moving with practiced ease. The Divine Duel minigame loaded instantly, displaying a grid of colored gems, green for growth, blue for water, gold for harvest, red for fire. The objective flashed, match 3 or more to defend against divine attacks. Simple enough. Lorien raised a wheat-woven hand, and the air crackled with energy. You will cease your meddling, or be made fertile ground for my wrath. Golden light gathered in his palm, forming a sphere of concentrated harvest energy that promised not growth, but overwhelming abundance that would crush everything beneath it. Lin tapped his screen, sliding a blue gem next to 2 other blues. The match dissolved with a cheerful chime. In reality, a shield of shimmering water erupted from the ground between Lin and Lorien, 10 feet tall and curved like a perfect droplet. It glowed with aquamarine light, and when Lorien's harvest sphere struck it, the water shield rippled but held firm. The impact sent waves of golden energy cascading outward, causing wheat to sprout instantly from every surface, from rooftops, from cobblestones, even from villagers' clothing where they'd taken shelter. Lorien stared at the water shield, his harvest moon eyes narrowing. How? No mortal should have been able to conjure such perfect divine protection without incantations, without offerings, without even a flicker of mana expenditure. He could sense no cultivation base in the peasant before him, no bloodline heritage, no connection to any known pantheon. Lin didn't hear the question. He was already tapping again, this time matching 3 green gems in an L shape. The game rewarded him with a combo bonus, notification and 50 aesthetic points. Vines erupted from the soil around Lorien's feet, not ordinary vines, but the same pixel-perfect growth that characterized Lin's orchard. They were thick as tree trunks, covered in thorns that gleamed like polished obsidian, and they moved with impossible speed. They wrapped around the wheat god's legs, climbing upward with a rustling sound that echoed through the square. Where they touched Lorien's wheat form, the golden stalks began to wither slightly, turning pale and brittle. Impudent mortal! Lorien roared, tearing at the vines with hands that now glowed with divine fury. Each vine he ripped away dissolved into motes of green light, but 3 more grew to replace it. The god focused his power, and the wheat comprising his form hardened into something resembling living metal, the vines snapping against it with sharp cracks. Lin's health bar on the smartphone dropped from 100 to 85. He frowned. This boss had good defense stats. He needed a better strategy. He opened the inventory screen briefly, considering his options. The sealed spirit gem containing Vorin glowed faintly in one slot. The divine rooster icon showed as available. But no, this was a puzzle game, not a pet battle. He returned to the gem-matching grid. Lorien gathered power again, this time not in his hands but throughout his entire form. The wheat composing his body began to glow with such intensity that villagers had to shield their eyes. The air grew hot and dry, carrying the scent of bread baking in a too-hot oven. I will burn your blasphemy from this land, he thundered, and golden flames erupted from his form, spreading outward in a wave that should have incinerated everything in the village square. Lin's fingers danced across the screen. Blue gem, blue gem, a vertical match of 4. Super match, the game announced. Then green, 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 a horizontal match. Combo. Gold, 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 another match. His energy dropped to 65, then 60, then 55 as he solved pattern after pattern with the focused intensity of someone trying to beat a high score. Reality warped around him. Where Lorien's golden flames should have burned, they instead encountered walls of shimmering water that rose from the ground in perfect geometric shapes, hexagons that interlocked to form a dome over the village square. The flames hissed against the water, producing steam that smelled of rain on hot stone. From the water-shielded ground, more vines grew, but these bore fruit, peaches that glowed with inner light and exploded when they touched Lorien's form, showering him with sticky nectar that made his weak body clump and slow. Then came the counterattack Lin hadn't anticipated. His last match had been 5 gold gems in a cross pattern, a divine match that the game rewarded with a fanfare of trumpets and 200 aesthetic points. In reality, the very wheat that comprised Lorien's body began to rebel. Stalks tore free from his limbs, swirling away to form independent shapes, a flock of wheat birds that pecked at his eyes, wheat vines that tangled his movements, even a wheat copy of Lin himself that mimicked his tapping motions mockingly. Lorien staggered back, his form flickering as he lost control of his own divine substance. "What sorcery is this?" he bellowed, but there was confusion in his voice now, and something else, fear. This wasn't combat as gods understood it. There were no exchanges of divine will, no clashes of domain against domain. This was pattern matching. This was puzzle solving. And it was effortlessly dismantling him. Lin's health bar sat at 40. He'd need to use a health potion soon if this kept up. He tapped to open the items screen, but before he could select anything, Lorien made his decision. The wheat god's form collapsed inward, the golden stalks flowing back into the vortex from which they'd come. "This is not over, usurper," his voice echoed from the swirling clouds. "I will return with allies who will pluck your power from you like overripe fruit." The vortex tightened, then vanished, leaving behind only a shower of ordinary wheat grains that pattered to the ground like rain. The village square fell silent. Lin lowered his smartphone, blinking at the sudden emptiness. The boss battle had ended abruptly, no victory fanfare, no loot drop, not even an experience point notification. Just, gone. He checked his perfect orchard progress, 83%. Well, at least he'd earned some aesthetic points from those matches. He tapped the screen to see if there were any new quests. The Divine Duel minigame had vanished from his menu, replaced by a new icon, Regional Tensions, 15%. Probably just flavor text. Around him, villagers began to emerge from hiding. Old Man Juan rose slowly from his kneeling position, his eyes fixed on the spot where the wheat god had stood. "Lin," he whispered, you drove off a god." "Did I?" Lin looked at his smartphone again. The hairline crack had spread further, now reaching almost to the center of the screen. When he tapped to check his energy, still at 40, the screen flickered ominously, the pixels distorting for a fraction of a second before returning to normal. That was new. Probably just needed charging. He'd have to find a way to plug it in later. May approached cautiously, her gaze shifting between Lin and the smartphone. "What was that?" she asked. "That light, those shields." She trailed off, unable to find words for what she'd witnessed. "Just a game," Lin said absently, already tapping to plant more virtual trees. In reality, saplings pushed through the soil at the edge of the square, oak trees that grew to full height in seconds, their leaves already turning autumn colors despite it being spring. The divine rooster emerged from behind the well and crowed once, triumphantly. Where its cry echoed, the fallen wheat grains sprouted into miniature stalks that bore fruit instantly, tiny apples no larger than peas, but perfect in every detail. Lin didn't notice any of this. He was too busy frowning at his smartphone. The flickering had returned, stronger this time. The screen went dark for a full second before lighting up again, displaying an error message he'd never seen before, reality sync incomplete, retrying. Then it vanished, and the normal game interface returned. He shrugged. Probably just a glitch. He had an orchard to perfect. High above, in realms mortals could not perceive, Lorien reformed in his divine palace, a structure woven from living grain and sunlight. His form trembled, not from injury, but from revelation. He reached out with his divine senses, touching the minds of other regional gods, the god of rivers, the goddess of mountains, the deity of storms. There is a new power in the mortal realm, he sent. One that does not play by our laws. Come. We must confer. In the county of dust, Lin yawned and stretched. That boss battle had been more tiring than he expected. Maybe he'd take a nap before tackling the next quest. He pocketed his smartphone, not noticing how its screen continued to flicker faintly through the fabric of his trousers, like a heartbeat of unstable light. The morning sun filtered through the cracks in Lin's hut, casting fractured patterns of light across the dirt floor. He sat on his straw mat, the glowing rectangle in his hands feeling heavier than usual. For days now, he'd been ignoring the subtle changes, the way the screen would occasionally flicker, how the pixelated icons sometimes blurred into strange shapes that didn't belong in his farming game. But today, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Lin turned the smartphone over in his calloused hands, his breath catching in his throat. The hairline crack from the Voron confrontation had spread like a spider's web across the entire surface. Thin, branching lines of darkness marred the glowing screen, and when he tilted the device, they caught the light like actual fissures in glass. The cracks weren't just cosmetic, they seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light that didn't match the game's cheerful pixel art aesthetic. He tapped the screen tentatively. The usual cheerful chime was distorted, coming out as a staticky crackle. The home screen loaded, but the icons for his farm, orchard, and puzzle games shimmered with ghostly afterimages. When he opened his farm management screen, the virtual crops overlapped with reality in a disorienting way. He could see both the pixelated wheat sprites and, through his window, the actual spirit-rich grain swaying in his fields. The two realities bled into each other, creating a dizzying double vision that made his head ache. This isn't right, Lin thought, his brow furrowing. He wasn't particularly clever about technology. He'd grown up in the county of dust where the most advanced tool was a well-maintained plow, but even he could tell something was fundamentally wrong with his divine interface. The game had always been his escape, his little secret pleasure after long days of toiling in barren fields. Now it felt fragile. Dangerous. He remembered the last few uses. Banishing Voron's ghost with those golden chains. Pacifying the beast-taming clan's creatures with the sorting puzzle. Fighting that strange golden wheat storm that had claimed to be a god. Each time, the screen had flickered a little more. Each time, the cracks had spread. And now, after that last, boss battle, as he thought of it, the device looked like it might shatter if he tapped too hard. Lin scrolled through his game menus, his fingers moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent countless hours on this virtual farm. There had to be a way to fix this. Games had maintenance options, didn't they? Repair functions. He found it in the settings menu, a tiny hammer icon labeled Device Integrity, that he'd never noticed before. It was grayed out, but when he tapped it, a new screen loaded with agonizing slowness. The repair interface wasn't like anything else in the game. Instead of cheerful pixel art, it showed a schematic of the smartphone itself, rendered in stark black and white lines. The cracks appeared as red, jagged fractures across the diagram. At the bottom of the screen, a new puzzle type appeared, not match 3, not sorting, but something called pixel reconstruction. The instructions were simple: align the fragments to restore integrity. Lin took a deep breath and began. The puzzle presented him with broken pieces of what looked like the smartphone screen, each fragment showing a distorted section of his farm interface. One piece showed half of his orchard progress bar at 83%. Another showed a corner of his divine rooster's coop. A third displayed part of the reality sync incomplete error message that had started appearing after the god confrontation. The fragments floated in a void, and he had to rotate and position them until they formed a complete image. His first attempt failed miserably. The fragments refused to snap together properly, and when he tried to force a connection, the entire screen glitched violently. The hut around him shimmered for a heartbeat, the walls became transparent, showing the fields outside as though they were right next to him, then snapped back to normal. Lin's heart hammered against his ribs. The air smelled of ozone, sharp and electric. He tried again, more carefully this time. The puzzle required intense concentration. Each fragment had to be rotated to just the right angle, positioned with millimeter precision. As he worked, he noticed his in-game stamina bar, usually a cheerful green, was draining rapidly. It dropped from 40 to 35, then 30, then 25. The repair was costing him something, drawing from whatever energy powered the divine interface. Outside, the world began to react. Old Man Juan, tending to his own plot at the edge of the village, paused as the ground beneath his feet gave a gentle shudder. It wasn't an earthquake, not exactly. More like the earth taking a deep breath and holding it. The spirit-rich grain in Lin's fields rippled in a wave that had nothing to do with wind. May, working her neighboring plot, looked up sharply, her eyes scanning the horizon for storm clouds that weren't there. Back in the hut, Lin was sweating. The puzzle was more complex than anything he'd encountered before. The fragments kept shifting, their edges changing shape as he worked. When he finally got two pieces to connect properly, a soft chime sounded, not the game's usual cheerful tone, but a deeper, more resonant note that vibrated in his bones. The cracks on the actual smartphone screen sealed slightly along one edge, the darkness retreating like ink being sucked back into a pen. Encouraged, Lin redoubled his efforts. His stamina dropped to 15, then 10. The air in the hut grew thick and heavy. Through his window, he could see the distant mountains, the jagged peaks that marked the border of the county of dust, begin to shift. Not dramatically, not enough to cause avalanches or landslides, but enough that if someone had been watching carefully, they would have seen the silhouette change. One peak seemed to lean slightly to the left. A ridge lowered by what might have been a few feet. The mountains adjusted themselves with a groaning sound that was too deep for human ears to hear, felt more in the stomach than heard with the ears. Lin didn't notice. He was focused entirely on the puzzle. 3 fragments connected now. 4. The cracks on the smartphone sealed further, the web of darkness retreating to cover only half the screen instead of the whole thing. But the cost was enormous. His stamina hit 5, then 3, then 1. The final fragment, showing part of his health bar at 40, floated before him. His hands shook as he rotated it, trying to find the right orientation. The edges kept changing, the image distorting. With a final, desperate tap, he slotted the last piece into place. The screen flashed white. Not the smartphone screen, the entire world went white for a fraction of a second. Lin's hut, the village, the fields, the mountains, everything vanished into pure, blinding light. Then reality snapped back with a sound like a thunderclap happening inside his skull. Lin blinked, his vision swimming. The smartphone in his hands looked better, not perfect, but the cracks had sealed to about a third of their original spread. The screen no longer flickered ominously. The reality sync incomplete error was gone, replaced by the usual farming interface. But his stamina bar was completely empty, a hollow red 0 that pulsed weakly. His health remained at 40, but a new warning icon appeared next to it, a cracked smartphone with an exclamation point. He set the device down carefully on the straw mat, his hands trembling. For the first time, he felt truly afraid of his little farming game. It wasn't just a game, was it? The mountains had moved. The ground had shaken. And whatever he'd just done had drained him in a way that physical labor never had, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that went beyond tired muscles. As he sat there, trying to process what had happened, a commotion arose outside. Voices. The sound of hoofbeats on the packed earth road that led through the village. Lin pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady, and went to the door. A rider in imperial livery had arrived. Not a local messenger, not a noble's courier, this man wore the gold and crimson of the emperor's personal guard. His horse was a magnificent beast, all sleek muscle and polished hooves, breathing steam into the cool morning air. The rider dismounted with practiced grace, his armor clinking softly. Villagers had gathered, whispering among themselves. Old Man Juan stood at the front of the crowd, his expression unreadable. May watched from the edge of her plot, her hands still dirty from the soil. The imperial messenger unrolled a scroll sealed with the emperor's personal sigil, a dragon coiled around a sun. His voice carried across the suddenly silent village, clear and authoritative. By decree of His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Liang III, ruler of the 7 provinces and keeper of the heavenly mandate, the messenger announced, the unknown cultivator responsible for the miracles occurring in the county of dust is summoned to the royal palace. The glowing crops that now grow upon the palace lawns have been deemed a sign of divine favor. The cultivators shall present themselves before the throne within 10 days' time to receive imperial recognition and explain the nature of these blessings. The messenger's eyes scanned the crowd, lingering on Lin's humble hut. The summons is not a request. Failure to appear will be considered treason against the throne. He re-rolled the scroll and approached Lin directly, holding out the document. Lin took it numbly, his fingers brushing against the fine parchment. The messenger leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a murmur meant only for Lin's ears. They say the crops grow where no seed was planted, the messenger whispered. They say flowers bloom in winter and water purifies itself. The emperor is curious. And when the emperor is curious, wise men answer his questions. With that, the messenger remounted his horse and rode back the way he'd come, leaving Lin standing in his doorway with an imperial summons in one hand and a cracked smartphone in the other. Through the still open door of his hut, he could see the device's screen glowing softly on the straw mat. The pixelated image of his perfect orchard showed 83% completion. And in the background of the farm interface, barely visible behind the icons and menus, the royal palace loomed in pixel art form, with glowing, spirit-rich crops spreading across its virtual lawns. The imperial summons lay heavy in Lin's hands, the parchment crisp and official with its golden seal. He stared at the characters, his peasant mind struggling to comprehend the words royal palace and mandatory attendance. Old man Juan had tried to explain the gravity, his wrinkled face pale with worry, but Lin's thoughts kept drifting back to his smartphone. The device felt warm in his pocket, its screen still showing faint cracks despite his repair efforts yesterday. New quest, Lin murmured to himself, his fingers tracing the glowing interface. The game had updated overnight, a golden exclamation mark pulsed over a miniature map of the kingdom. When he tapped it, text scrolled across the screen, journey to the capital, the emperor requests your presence. Use fast travel to expedite your arrival. Fast travel. Lin remembered seeing the option before, a swirling vortex icon he'd never dared to touch. But the summons gave him 10 days, and walking would take weeks through bandit-infested roads. He glanced around his modest hut, at the divine rooster dozing in the corner, its feathers shimmering with faint light. The beast-taming clans had left yesterday after pledging allegiance, leaving behind only the lingering scent of their tribute creatures. Well, Lin said aloud, can't keep the emperor waiting. He tapped the fast travel icon. The smartphone vibrated violently, the cracks in its screen glowing with intense blue light. A swirling portal of distorted pixels materialized before him, tearing through the air with a sound like ripping fabric. Lin hesitated only a moment before stepping through. The world dissolved into streaks of color and noise. He felt weightless, disoriented, as though falling through a kaleidoscope. Then solid ground slammed into his feet, and he stumbled forward, nearly dropping the smartphone. The transition left his ears ringing. Around him, travelers on the capital's main road cried out in alarm. A merchant's cart overturned as the horses reared, spilling bolts of silk across the cobblestones. A spatial rift, a jagged tear in reality, lingered where Lin had appeared, shimmering with unstable energy before collapsing with a thunderous crack. People stared at him with wide eyes, some pointing, others backing away. Lin blinked, adjusting to the sudden shift from his quiet village to the bustling capital. Apologies, he mumbled, but no one seemed to hear him over the commotion. The capital stretched before him in overwhelming grandeur. Towers pierced the sky, their roofs tiled with jade and gold. The air smelled of incense and spices, not the earthy scent of his fields. Crowds flowed through wide avenues, nobles in silks brushing past commoners in rough-spun cloth. And there, looming at the city's heart, stood the royal palace, a structure so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. Lin's attention snapped to the palace lawns. Even from this distance, he could see them, familiar golden stalks of spirit-rich grain, exactly like the crops he'd grown back home. They carpeted the manicured grass in perfect rows, glowing with soft luminescence that contrasted sharply with the palace's austere stone. His virtual crops, growing on the emperor's lawn. The sight was so absurd he almost laughed. My harvest, he whispered, a farmer's instinct overriding caution. Without thinking, he pulled out his smartphone. The screen flickered briefly, the device strained warning pulsing red before fading. He navigated to the farming interface, where icons of his crops appeared alongside progress bars. The palace lawn crops showed as ready for harvest, a pixelated scythe icon hovered over them. Lin tapped the harvest command. The game responded with a farming puzzle, a grid of colored seeds that needed matching in groups of 3 or more to collect the bounty. His fingers moved automatically, sliding virtual seeds into alignment. With each successful match, the screen flashed, and a portion of his in-game energy bar, already low from yesterday's repairs, drained further. In the real world, the golden crops on the palace lawn began to shimmer. Their glow intensified, pulsing in time with Lin's puzzle solves. Soil around them darkened, becoming richer, almost black with divine energy. Guards stationed along the perimeter shifted uneasily, hands on their sword hilts. Lin completed the final match. The puzzle dissolved into a shower of pixelated coins and experience points. His energy bar dropped precipitously, leaving only a sliver remaining. A wave of fatigue washed over him, making his limbs feel heavy and his thoughts sluggish. On the lawn, the harvested crops didn't vanish. Instead, they began to change. Stalks thickened, twisting into fibrous limbs. Leaves unfurled into grasping tendrils. Roots pulled free from the soil with wet, tearing sounds. Within moments, dozens of walking plants stood where crops had been, sentient beings of woven grain and glowing sap, their movements jerky but purposeful. They began to roam. The first plant creature stepped onto the cobblestone path leading from the lawn. A guard shouted a challenge, but the creature ignored him, moving with unsettling grace toward the city streets. More followed, spreading in all directions. Panic erupted as citizens realized what was happening. A noblewoman screamed as a walking plant brushed against her gown, leaving streaks of glowing pollen. Merchants scrambled to protect their wares as the creatures wandered through market stalls, their tendrils curiously probing fruits and fabrics. Lin stared, his fatigue momentarily forgotten. "That's not supposed to happen," he said blankly. "In the game, harvesting just gave resources. There were no walking plants in the tutorial." He tried to open the pet management screen, thinking he could sort them like he had the tribute creatures, but the interface responded sluggishly, glitching with distorted pixels. The smartphone felt hot in his hands, the cracks glowing ominously. He could feel the strain radiating from it, a tangible pressure against his palm. A voice boomed across the courtyard. Lin looked up. 3 figures descended from the sky, landing with impacts that cracked the cobblestones. In the center stood Lorien, god of harvests. Lin recognized him from their previous encounter, though now his form seemed more solid, less storm-like. Golden wheat still swirled around him, but his expression held cold fury rather than bewildered rage. Flanking him were 2 other beings. To his left hovered a woman made of flowing water and shifting ice, her features crystalline and sharp, the goddess of rivers, her presence making the air damp and chill. To his right stood a man whose body seemed formed from compacted stone and soil, with moss growing across his shoulders, the god of mountains, each step causing minor tremors through the ground. They surrounded Lin in a loose triangle, cutting off any escape. The walking plants continued their oblivious wandering around them, some bumping against divine barriers that shimmered into existence. "You dare alter my domain again?" Lorien's voice vibrated through the air. "And now you bring your chaos to the heart of the kingdom?" The goddess of rivers spoke, her words like flowing water over stones. We felt the spatial tear. Such crude manipulation of reality. The emperor's summons was but a lure, the god of mountains rumbled, his voice deep as shifting earth. "We would have this confrontation where all can witness your reckoning." Lin's mind raced, but fatigue and confusion muddled his thoughts. He looked down at his smartphone. The screen glowed fiercely now, not with its usual interface but with pulsing red warnings. New text scrolled, multiple divine threats detected. Reality sync overload. Recommend immediate disengagement. The device grew hotter, almost burning his skin. The cracks spread further, webbing across the entire surface. In his palm, it felt like holding a star about to go supernova. The 3 gods advanced, their power coalescing into tangible pressure that made the air thick and hard to breathe. Around them, the walking plants paused as if sensing the gathering storm, their glowing forms turning toward the confrontation. Lin's fingers tightened around the smartphone. The world seemed to hold its breath. The air in the royal palace courtyard crackled with divine energy, thick enough to taste like ozone and honey. Lin stood frozen, his back pressed against the cold marble of a decorative pillar as 3 figures materialized before him in flashes of impossible light. Lorien, god of harvests, had returned, but this time, he wasn't alone. To his left, a woman coalesced from flowing water and mist, her form shifting like a river current. The goddess of rivers, Lin's mind supplied uselessly, remembering the brief glimpse from before. To Lorien's right, a mountainous figure took shape, all jagged stone and rumbling earth, the god of mountains, whose presence made the ground tremble faintly beneath Lin's worn peasant shoes. "You think your tricks will save you now, pretender?" Lorien's voice boomed, each word shaking the very air. Golden wheat sprouted from the cracks in the courtyard stones, then withered instantly as his anger flared. "You've defiled my domain, corrupted the natural order." The rivers flow backward where he walked, the water goddess interrupted, her voice a cascade of liquid notes. "My tributaries report distortions in their beds. This cannot stand." "The mountains shift when he dreams," rumbled the stone god, his words like grinding tectonic plates. "My peaks are restless. This ends today." Lin's fingers trembled as he fumbled for the glowing rectangle in his tunic pocket. The smartphone felt hot to the touch, almost burning, and when he pulled it out, he saw the cracks had spread further across the screen since yesterday. They formed a delicate web of black lines through the pixelated interface, pulsing with a sickly red light around the edges. The screen flickered, a tree icon appearing, then dissolving into static, then reforming. His orchard. His perfect orchard was at 99% completion. Panic clawed at his throat, but a deeper, more stubborn part of his mind latched onto the familiar. The game. The orchard. The achievement notification that had been teasing him for weeks now. If he could just place that final tree. He reaches for his artifact. Lorien shouted, and all three gods moved at once. Golden wheat erupted from the ground, whipping toward Lin like living ropes. Water surged from a nearby fountain, hardening into crystalline spears midair. Stones tore themselves from the courtyard paving, flying toward him with mountain-crushing force. Lin's thumb found the screen. He didn't think, he tapped. The perfect orchard interface opened, showing his virtual plot with one empty square remaining in the top right corner. A pixelated sapling icon hovered there, waiting. With shaking fingers, he dragged it into place. A puzzle grid appeared instantly, a complex arrangement of colored fruits that needed matching. 3 cherries here, 4 apples there, a chain of peaches across the diagonal. His mind, honed by countless hours of mindless tapping, snapped into focus. This was just another puzzle. Just another game. He solved the first match as golden wheat wrapped around his ankles. The vines dissolved into harmless light. He solved the second as water spears shattered against an invisible barrier that shimmered like heat haze. He solved the third as the flying stones veered away, crashing harmlessly into a wall. The gods paused, their expressions shifting from rage to confusion to dawning alarm. "What sorcery is this?" the mountain god growled, but Lin wasn't listening. He was tapping frantically now, his eyes locked on the screen. Match after match after match. Each solution drained something from the bar at the top of his screen, his in-game energy, which had already been nearly empty. The number ticked down, 3, 2, 1. But it didn't matter. The puzzle was almost complete. With a final tap, he aligned 5 golden pairs in a vertical row. The screen flashed white. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the world began to grow. It started at Lin's feet, a single shoot of green pushing through marble. Then another. And another. Trees sprouted not from soil but from stone, from air, from the very fabric of reality itself. Apple trees with bark that shimmered like polished copper. Peach trees whose leaves rustled with whispered secrets. Pear trees that bent under the weight of fruits glowing with inner light. The orchard expanded in a silent explosion of growth, swallowing the courtyard whole. Marble pillars became trellises for grapevines. The fountain became a pond at the center of a ring of citrus trees. The gods found themselves surrounded, then enclosed, then trapped within a labyrinth of impossible flora. Lorien tried to summon his wheat, it sprouted, then immediately fruited into fat ears of grain that fell harmlessly to the ground. The goddess of rivers called water from the air, it condensed into dewdrops on leaves, then evaporated. The god of mountains attempted to shatter the trees with tremors, the roots simply dug deeper, anchoring reality more firmly. This is creation magic," the water goddess whispered, her form flickering as a peach tree grew through where her legs should have been. Pure, unmediated creation. Not even the God King. Lin barely heard her. He was staring at his screen, where a notification bloomed in cheerful pixelated letters. Achievement unlocked, perfect orchard. Reward, eternal blossom, orchard produces fruit year-round. A grin spread across his face, wide and genuine and utterly oblivious. He'd done it. After all those weeks of grinding, after all those failed attempts and resource management headaches, he'd finally completed the achievement. The little progress bar that had haunted his gameplay was now full. The orchard was perfect. He looked up from the screen, taking in the transformed courtyard. The trees formed a beautiful, orderly grid, just like in the game interface. Fruits hung heavy on every branch, apples that shimmered with captured sunlight, pears that hummed with harmonic frequencies, peaches whose scent promised forgotten memories. Between the trees, pathways of soft moss wound through dappled shade. And the gods. Lorien stood frozen, one hand outstretched toward an apple tree that had grown around his fingers. The fruit on that particular branch glowed with a gentle golden light that seemed to absorb his divine energy rather than reflect it. The goddess of rivers had partially dissolved into a mist that now hung among the leaves of a willow tree, unable to reform. The god of mountains had sunk knee-deep into the ground, his stone form merging with the orchard's roots. "It's beautiful," Lin murmured to himself, completely missing the cosmic implications of what he'd just done. He took a step forward, his worn shoes sinking into moss that hadn't existed moments before. The air smelled of ripe fruit and blooming flowers, a scent so perfect it felt artificial, like the developers had coated the ideal orchard fragrance. He reached out and touched the bark of the nearest apple tree. It felt real. Solid. Warm, like living wood in sunlight. Then his smartphone buzzed violently in his hand. Lin looked down. The screen, which had been displaying his achievement notification, suddenly flashed crimson. Not the cheerful red of game alerts, but a deep, warning red that pulsed like a heartbeat. Text scrolled across the cracked display. System overload, divine convergence detected. Reality synchronization at 147% and climbing. Advisory, cease all divine interface operations. The cracks in the screen glowed with the same red light, spreading further with each pulse. Lin could feel the device growing hotter, almost too hot to hold. He fumbled it, nearly dropping it before catching it against his chest. "What now?" he muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. "I just fixed you." He tapped the screen, trying to dismiss the warning. Nothing happened. The red text remained, pulsing ominously. Beyond the orchard's boundary, which now extended well past the original courtyard walls, incorporating parts of the palace gardens and even some nearby streets, figures gathered. On a balcony high above, Emperor Liang III stood flanked by his most powerful cultivators. The emperor's robes of imperial yellow seemed dull compared to the orchard's vibrant colors. His face was unreadable, but his hands gripped the balcony railing tightly enough to whiten his knuckles. The cultivators beside him murmured to one another, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. One of them, an elderly man with a beard like spun silver, held a detection talisman that had shattered in his hand, its pieces glowing with residual divine energy. "That's not cultivation," the silver-bearded cultivator whispered. "That's something else entirely." "Can we contain it?" another asked, her voice tight. The emperor didn't answer. He just watched as the orchard continued to subtly expand, its trees growing fractionally taller with each passing breath. And far away, in a realm beyond mortal comprehension, something stirred. A presence older than mountains, vaster than oceans, more eternal than stars. The god-king of the pantheon, who had slumbered for millennia while his regional gods managed creation, felt a disturbance in the fabric of reality. Not the minor tremors caused by Lin's earlier actions, but a fundamental shift, a new power rewriting the rules of existence itself. In the darkness of his celestial chamber, eyes that had been closed for ages flickered open. They saw not light, but the patterns of creation, and those patterns were being redrawn by an unfamiliar hand. Back in the orchard, Lin sighed and pocketed his overheating smartphone. The warning continued to pulse against his thigh, a constant reminder that something was wrong. But the orchard was complete. The achievement was his. He'd won. He walked to the central pond, formerly the fountain, and sat on its mossy edge. The water was clear and still, reflecting the impossible trees and the trapped gods. A fish swam by, its scales shimmering with colors that didn't exist in nature. "Well," Lin said to no one in particular, "at least the grinding's over." He plucked a nearby apple. It came away easily, fitting perfectly in his palm. He took a bite. The flavor exploded in his mouth, sweet, crisp, perfect. Exactly like the perfect fruit description in the game. As he chewed, he didn't notice how the god's struggles grew weaker. Didn't see how the orchard's roots were slowly draining their divine energy, feeding it back into the trees. Didn't feel the distant attention of something infinitely greater turning toward him. He just enjoyed his apple, sitting in his perfect orchard, completely unaware that he had just become the single most important being in all of creation.